Our story tonight takes us to Constantinople in the spring of 542 as the grain fleet unloads. In the harbour of Constantinople, beneath the walls of the imperial capital, Egyptian grain ships have begun to dock. It is the year 542, and the Emperor Justinian has reigned for 15 years. The city may have held around 500,000 souls, making it one of the greatest metropolises in the Mediterranean world. The harbour of Alexandria stirs before dawn on what may be a morning in the year 541, and you are standing among the wooden crates that line the western mole as the first pale light rises over the Nile Delta. Around you, the dockworkers move in the half-darkness, their bare feet pressing into planks still warm from yesterday's sun, and the smell of river water mixes with the dust of centuries and the fine powder of wheat that coats every surface like pale snow. The great granary of the Roman and Byzantine Empire once sent its agricultural wealth northward across the Mediterranean Sea, and Egypt's fertile lands continue their long tradition of morning offerings. You watch a man in a linen tunic hoist a sack of grain onto his shoulder, his muscles visible beneath the thin fabric, and you notice how he pauses to wipe his brow with a forearm that trembles slightly more than the weight would explain. Another man, younger, coughs into his fist as he passes with a coil of rope, and the sound is lost beneath the creak of wooden hulls settling in their berths, and the soft flapping of sails being readied in the spring wind that comes off the desert. The harbour of Alexandria has always been a place of such small human moments, each one insignificant against the vast machinery of empire, yet each one carrying within it the seeds of history that will only be recognized by those who come long after. The grain ships that sail regularly from Alexandria to Constantinople maintain the capital's food supply, and this morning 3 of them ride at anchor in the outer harbour, their holds being filled with the wheat that makes Egypt so essential to the survival of distant cities. Egypt held special status among Roman provinces due to its grain production and certain legal exceptions, privileges won long ago and maintained through every shift of power. And you can see that special status written in the scale of this operation, the hundreds of men employed, the mountains of sacks rising on the quayside. The city of Constantinople was founded as Byzantium, traditionally said to be around 660 BC by Greek settlers, those seafarers who recognized the strategic value of the Bosphorus, and though that distant settlement bears little resemblance to what would come, the same practical wisdom governs these morning labors. A merchant in a dark cloak moves past you, counting sacks with a tally stick, and his voice is low and methodical as he speaks to a clerk who follows with a wax tablet. The smell of Nile water mixed with dust and grain dust in Alexandria's harbour is something you will not forget, a particular combination of fertility and commerce, of life-giving river and the dry air that preserves what the river produces. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, likely Biovar antiqua, caused the Justinianic plague, though no one standing on these planks in the year 541 could know that name or recognize the microscopic agent that moves among them now, silent and invisible as breath. The first signs of illness among dockworkers and sailors are dismissed as ordinary fever, as they always have been, as they always will be in the years before understanding catches up with observation. You see a sailor sitting on a bollard, his head in his hands, while his companions load provisions around him, and they call to him with rough affection, telling him he has drunk too much wine, telling him the spring air will clear his head. The disease spread via trade routes connecting Egypt to the wider Mediterranean, routes that carried silks and spices and grain and ideas, and now carry something else entirely, something that needs no passport and pays no tariff, something that travels in the blood of men and in the bodies of the rats that share every ship and every warehouse. The warmth of sun-heated planks beneath bare feet during loading is a pleasure that belongs to these early hours, before the full heat of the day makes labor a penance, and you feel that warmth through your own souls as you move along the quay, watching the fleet prepare. Rats and their fleas are widely believed to have served as important vectors of transmission aboard ships, though recent scholarship has questioned whether rats alone were the primary drivers of plague spread, with human fleas and lice potentially playing larger roles than traditionally assumed. The grain ships of Alexandria have always carried such passengers, as every ship has carried them since the first hull was hollowed from a tree, and only now, in this particular spring, does the ordinary become catastrophic. The fleet departs on the morning tide, carrying invisible death across the Mediterranean, and you stand at the harbour mouth watching the sails diminish toward the northern horizon, white wings against a pale sky. The year 541 is the year the pandemic first appears in Egypt, entering the historical record not with trumpets, but with whispers, with the absence of men from their usual places, with the quiet closing of doors and the stillness that falls where activity once reigned. You remain in Alexandria as the ships grow small, and the creak of wooden hulls and flapping of sails in the spring wind fades into the greater silence of the open sea, that silence which will not last, which never lasts, for sound carries across water, and what travels with these vessels will make itself heard in time. The harbour of Alexandria empties slowly through the morning, the immediate frenzy of loading giving way to the slower rhythms of repair and preparation, of nets being mended and ropes being coiled for the next departure. You walk among the warehouses now, where the grain that remains is stored against future need, and the smell of Nile water mixed with dust and grain dust in Alexandria's harbour has settled into something more settled, more permanent, the smell of a place that has made its bargain with the river and lives by the terms. The enormous agricultural wealth of Egypt will continue to flow outward, to Constantinople and beyond, for this interruption is not yet visible as interruption, merely as the ordinary ebb and flow of human fortune. A woman passes you carrying a basket of bread, and the ordinary gesture of breaking a crust and offering half to a child seems suddenly precious, suddenly worth noting, as though some part of you already knows that such moments will become rarer in the months to come. Yet the year 541 is already different, already marked, though the mark will only be read in retrospect by those who survive to read it. You spend the afternoon in the city proper, away from the harbour, and the narrow streets of Alexandria close around you with their familiar weight of commerce and conversation, the shops opening after the midday pause, the scholars moving between libraries with their scrolls under their arms. The evening finds you back at the harbour, where the last light turns the water to beaten bronze, and the gulls settle onto their roosts with the resigned cries of creatures whose day of scavenging has ended. A rat emerges from beneath a pile of nets, pauses, disappears again, and you think of the ships that left this morning, of the holds where grain and stowaways travel together toward distant ports. Rats and their fleas are commonly believed to have served as primary vectors of transmission aboard ships, and the journey that began today will not end with the arrival of cargo. The night passes in the manner of nights in harbour cities, with the sound of water against stone and the occasional voice carrying from ships at anchor, and you wake to another dawn, another day of loading, another fleet preparing to depart. The harbour of Alexandria continues its work, for the granary of the Roman and Byzantine Empire does not rest, cannot rest, and the enormous agricultural wealth of Egypt must continue to flow, or the distant capital will know hunger. You watch another ship depart on the third morning, and then another, and the rhythm of departure becomes almost soothing in its regularity, the white sails appearing and disappearing against the northern sky, with the predictability of seasons. The year 541 continues in its course, and the pandemic first appears in Egypt, entering the historical record in the private letters of merchants, in the gaps in official correspondence, in the rumors that travel faster than any ship. The spring advances, and the spring wind that comes off the desert grows warmer, drier, carrying less of the Nile's moisture and more of the dust that will characterize the summer to come. You find yourself noticing the health of strangers now, the flush of a cheek that might be sunburn or might be fever, the cough that persists beyond the ordinary irritation of harbor air. The fleet departs, carrying invisible death across the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean receives it as it has received everything that human beings have ever carried upon its waters, with indifference and with time. The harbor of Alexandria in late spring is a place of increasing shadows, though the sun grows brighter and the days longer, and you feel those shadows in the conversations that stop when you approach, in the doors that close more quickly than they once did. You decide to travel with the grain fleet, to follow the wheat to its destination, and the morning of your departure finds you on the deck of a merchant vessel as the harbor of Alexandria recedes into the haze of distance. The taste of salt on the air as ships enter the Mediterranean proper is a sharp transition from the river taste you have grown accustomed to, a reminder of the open water that lies between here and there, between Egypt and the world that depends upon it. The creak of wooden hulls and flapping of sails in the spring wind takes on a new quality when you are aboard, when the sound surrounds you rather than reaching you from a distance, and you feel the vessel's motion in your legs, in your stomach, in the constant small adjustments that standing on a deck requires. The voyage passes in the manner of such voyages, days of blue water and night skies brilliant with stars that seem to shift their patterns as you move northward, the gradual cooling of the air, the changing of the water's color from deep blue to the greener tones of the more northerly sea. You share the deck with rats that emerge at night, bold with hunger, and you watch them with a new attention, a new awareness of what they might carry. Rats and their fleas served as the primary vectors of transmission aboard ships, and the fleet that carries grain carries also these other travelers, these companions that do not pay for passage and do not appear on any manifest. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, specifically Biovar antiqua, caused the Justinianic plague, and it is here, among these vessels, making the same journey you make, though more slowly, more silently, more thoroughly. The first deaths occur at sea, a sailor who falls from the rigging in a fever dream, a passenger whose body is committed to the waves with the brief prayers that custom allows. The first signs of illness among dockworkers and sailors were dismissed as ordinary fever, and the same dismissal governs these maritime deaths, the same reluctance to name what might be named, to see what might be seen. The land appears on the seventh day, first as a darkening of the horizon, then as definite shapes, hills and headlands that the sailors name with the familiarity of long repetition. The fleet departs from Alexandria, carrying invisible death across the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean has received that death and passed it on, as it passes on everything that touches its waters, transformed and yet continuous, the same and not the same. The city of Constantinople rises before you in the morning light, and you understand immediately why men have called it the World City, the prototype of an imperial metropolis from the 4th century onward. The sound of gulls crying over the Golden Horn at dawn mingles with the greater sounds of a harbor that makes Alexandria seem a provincial station. The vast expanse of water crowded with vessels of every size and origin, the shores lined with warehouses and palaces, and the domes of churches that catch the first light. The city was founded as Byzantium around 660 BC by Dorian settlers from mainland Greece, those practical colonists who saw the value of this position. This control of the passage between Europe and Asia, and their descendants have built upon that foundation, until the original seems almost invisible beneath the accumulation. You disembark with the other passengers, with the sailors who have survived the voyage, and the usual bustle of commerce and unloading surrounds you immediately, the same and yet not the same as what you left behind. The first deaths in the city occur quietly at first, in the quarter near the harbour where the sailors lodge between voyages, in the warehouses where the grain is stored before distribution. The year 541 is ending, and the year 542 approaches, and the plague reaches Constantinople in that new year, brought by the grain fleet that you followed across the sea. You walk through the streets in the days after arrival, and the city reveals itself in layers, the ancient walls of Byzantium visible in places beneath the marble of Constantine's ambition, the newer construction of Theodosius and his successors rising everywhere in testimony to continuous growth. In 330 AD, Constantine the Great made the city his imperial residence, officially naming it Nova Roma, and the traces of that naming persist in the formal documents, in the pretensions of empire that outlast any individual ruler. After Constantine's death in 337 AD, the city was officially renamed Constantinople, and that name has stuck, has become what the world knows, what the world uses when it speaks of this place where Europe meets Asia, where the sea meets the land. Theodosius I made Constantinople the capital of what modern scholars call the Byzantine Empire, and you see his legacy in the administrative buildings that cluster near the Great Palace, in the officials who move through the streets with the self-importance of men who govern a world. The city remained capital until Ottoman conquest in 1453, except for the Fourth Crusade interruption, a span of centuries that seems almost unimaginable in its duration, its persistence, its capacity to survive what now approaches. Under the names Constantinople and Istanbul, it served as Ottoman capital until 1922, and even that later history seems present somehow, implicit in the city's geography, in the way the land and water shape what humans build upon them. The first deaths in the city gather speed as the weeks pass, the quiet beginnings giving way to something more visible, more audible, more impossible to ignore. You hear the funeral processions in the streets, the professional mourners whose cries have become more frequent, more hurried, as though the supply of grief cannot keep pace with the demand. The plague reaches Constantinople, brought by the grain fleet, and the fleet continues to come, for the capital must eat, the machinery of empire must be fed, and the granary of the Roman and Byzantine Empire must continue to produce even as it sickens, even as it dies. You find yourself returning to the harbour, to the place where the grain ships unload, and the scene is both familiar and transformed, the same wooden hulls and flapping sails, the same creak of rigging and cry of gulls, but with a new quality underneath, a hesitation, a watching. But the first deaths in the city, quietly at first, then with gathering speed, have begun to teach what experience will confirm, what history will record, what the year 542 will make undeniable. The ships will go back, will load again, will continue the circuit that connects two cities, two worlds, into a single system of survival and dependence, and now, unintended, of death. The evening finds you on a hill above the Golden Horn, watching the light fade from the water, from the domes, from the distant shores that are already Asia, already elsewhere. The night comes slowly, the northern summer holding the light long past the hour when Alexandria would be dark, and you remain on your hill as the stars emerge, as the city below settles into the uneasy rest of a place that knows itself threatened. The harbour of Alexandria prepares its morning offering even now, even as you stand on this hill above the Golden Horn, and the grain ships that connect these two cities continue their work, their necessary, fatal, unending work. You stand on your hill as the darkness completes itself, as the stars find their full brightness, and the world city that is Constantinople settles into the night that precedes the long trial that awaits. You descend from your hill as the night deepens, moving through streets that have grown quieter than they should be, past doors that are barred, past windows that show no light. The year 542 is the year of death in Constantinople, the year that will be remembered, that will be recorded, that will become part of the long story of how plague traveled from Egypt, how the granary of empire became the source of its affliction, how the ships that maintained the capital brought also what very nearly destroyed it. The sound of water lapping against stone follows you through the streets, the same sound that accompanied your nights in Alexandria, the same sound that will accompany every harbor city until the end of harbors. The first deaths in the city, quietly at first, then with gathering speed, have gathered now to a pace that cannot be denied, and the quiet is gone, replaced by something else, something that will become the characteristic sound of this year, this place, this moment in the long history of how disease moves through human civilization. You find a place to rest, a corner of a courtyard where the night air moves gently, where the stars are visible through a gap in the buildings, where the distant sound of the harbor reaches you as a murmur rather than a cry. The year 541 was the year the pandemic first appears in Egypt, entering the historical record, and the year 542 is the year that record expands, that the entry becomes a chapter, that the chapter becomes a volume, that the volume becomes the story of a world transformed. The night moves slowly toward morning, and you feel the slowness in your own body, in the heaviness of your limbs, in the gentle persistence of a fatigue that might be ordinary, might be something else. You close your eyes to the stars, to the night, to the knowledge of what approaches, and the darkness receives you as the sea receives the grain ships, as the empire receives its sustenance, as history receives the record of what human beings suffered and what they endured. The morning light comes gradually, a pallining of the eastern sky that you observe through half-closed eyes, a transition so gentle it seems almost to belong to another order of experience, another mode of time. The golden light of dawn on the copper roofs of the great palace spreads slowly across the skyline as you stand at the harbor wall, your hands resting on cool stone worn smooth by generations of sailors and merchants. The year is 541 AD, and the city before you has never appeared more magnificent, more assured of its place at the center of the world. Ships from Alexandria and Carthage, from Antioch and Ravenna, rock gently at their moorings along the Golden Horn, their hulls laden with the produce of an empire that stretches from the Atlantic approaches to the Euphrates frontier. The reign of Justinian has already lasted 14 years, beginning in 527 AD, when a middle-aged provincial from Tauresium assumed the purple. And those years have transformed this city into something unprecedented in scale and ambition. The harbor water reflects a sky that pales from rose to amber as the sun clears the hills of Asia across the narrow strait, and you feel the first warmth touch your cheek where the cold air of early morning still lingers. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of grain from Egypt, those vital shipments that sustain a population which may have approached 500,000 inhabitants, a concentration of humanity unmatched in the Mediterranean world. The Theodosian walls, completed in the early 5th century, stand visible in the distance where they enclosed the landward side of the city, their triple defense system having never yet been breached by any enemy. Men call to one another in Greek and in Latin, the two languages of administration and culture that mingle here as they once did in the old Rome of the West, and occasionally you catch fragments of Gothic or Aramaic from foreign mercenaries or Syrian traders who have made this port their temporary home. You move with the flow of the crowd away from the waterfront, passing through streets where the scent of incense drifts from church doors along the colonnaded thoroughfares, that particular fragrance of frankincense and myrrh that marks the hour of morning prayer. Somewhere a bell sounds, not the deep iron of later centuries, but the lighter percussion of struck wood that calls the faithful to their devotions. The city believes itself eternal in this year, believes that the achievements of Justinian's reign have secured for it a permanence that no mere mortal disruption could threaten. The policy of Restauratio Imperii has already recovered North Africa from the Vandals and much of Italy from the Ostrogoths, and Byzantine forces continue to press their advantages on multiple frontiers. The empire stands at the apparent height of its power and territorial extent, and this confidence permeates every transaction, every greeting, every glance exchanged between citizens who know themselves to be the inheritors and renewers of Roman greatness. The Mise opens before you now, that broad artery which runs from the imperial quarter to the western gates, its paving stones laid with the precision that only Roman engineering could achieve. You're walking through the morning processions that move along this main channel of urban life, past the forums and basilicas, where the business of empire is conducted with bureaucratic thoroughness. The bronze gate rises ahead, its metal sheeting catching the strengthening light, and beyond it lies the complex of buildings where the imperial administration labors through the hours of daylight. Clerks and officials, eunuchs and secretaries move between chambers with scrolls and codices under their arms, their soft shoes making no sound on the marble floors. The Corpus Juris Civilis, that monumental legal codification completed in this period, guides their deliberations, a systematic ordering of Roman law that will outlast the very empire it serves. The murmur of Greek and Latin in the marketplace accompanies your progress as you pause to observe the exchange of goods and currencies, the weighing of silver, and the assessment of grain quality. Free distributions to citizens have become a cornerstone of urban stability here, the grain supply subsidized to ensure that no crowd need ever again threaten the order of the state, as it did during the Nika riots of 532. You remember, or seem to remember, the stories of that earlier violence, the fires that consumed much of the ceremonial heart, the demands for imperial change that shook the throne itself. From those ashes, Justinian had rebuilt Hagia Sophia in its monumental form, and now that reconstruction stands complete, its dome seeming to float above the city like the very vault of heaven brought down to earth. You turn northward through streets that narrow and then widen again according to the ancient plan of the city's growth, past workshops where silk production has been established, breaking the Persian monopoly that had long constrained Roman access to this most luxurious of textiles. The secret of the silkworm has been smuggled westward, or so the whispered stories claim, and now Constantinople nurtures its own industry, feeding the insatiable demand of court and clergy and wealthy merchant. The threads shimmer where they hang in doorways, catching the morning light in iridescent patterns that speak of distant origins and transformed possibilities. The empire that could recover lost territories could also recover lost knowledge, could bend the monopolies of rivals to its own purposes, could imagine itself capable of any transformation that served its enduring needs. The cool darkness of the cisterns awaits where you descend through a doorway at street level, passing from the noise of commerce into an underground world of dripping water and vaulted stillness. The basilica cistern spreads before you, its hundreds of columns reflected in the still pool that stores the city's water supply, brought via aqueducts that traverse the Thracian countryside with the same engineering confidence that built the roads of Italy. Water falling from vaulted ceilings marks the passage of time in this subterranean space, each drop a small percussion that echoes and fades into the greater silence. You stand motionless, listening to the slow music of storage and survival, the hidden infrastructure that makes possible the display and the ceremony above. The city's density and connectivity, you understand in this moment, depend upon such invisible systems, the networks of pipe and channel that bind together 500,000 lives in mutual dependence. The distant sound of the sea against the harbour walls reaches even here, filtered through stone and earth to become a whisper of the world that waits beyond. You ascend again to the surface, blinking in the full brightness of mid-morning, and make your way toward the ceremonial heart where the Hippodrome, Hagia Sophia, and Great Palace form the interconnected spaces of imperial display. The great church draws you now, its bulk increasingly visible as you navigate the final approach through streets crowded with worshippers gathering at the newly completed structure. Their anticipation is palpable, their conversations subdued in the presence of something they recognize as surpassing ordinary human achievement. You pass through the narthex with these pilgrims and emerge into a space that defies the expectations of anyone who has known only smaller, earthbound sanctuaries. The dome seeming to float above the nave creates an effect of weightlessness, of heaven pressing down to meet the raised eyes of the faithful, and the light that enters through clerestory windows transforms the interior into a golden atmosphere that seems itself a form of worship. Mosaics shimmer where they catch this illumination, their surfaces composed of countless tesserae that shift and change with the movement of the sun. The scent of incense intensifies in enclosed space and the breath of many worshippers, and the murmur of prayer and greeting rises and falls like the breathing of some vast organism. The year is 541 AD, and Justinian's reign has brought this into being, has sustained the ambition that could imagine and execute such a structure. You stand among the gathered, faithful as the liturgy proceeds, the Greek of the celebrants rising in measured cadences that have shaped Christian worship across centuries and will continue to shape it long after this particular morning has passed into memory. The empire that built this church has also codified its laws, has recovered its western territories, has established its silk production, and secured its grain supply. The Corpus Juris Civilis guides the administrators who move through the Bronze Gate even now, and Byzantine forces maintain their positions in Italy and Africa and along the eastern frontier. Everything speaks of confidence, of momentum, of a restored Roman world that has found its second center and its second wind. Yet the cool darkness of the cisterns remains in your memory, that underground world where water falling from vaulted ceilings measured out a different rhythm from the public display above. The city's density and connectivity made it uniquely vulnerable to pandemic spread. Though no one speaks of this in the golden morning, no one whispers the name of the plague that would strike just as these achievements seem to promise a restored Roman world. You move with the dispersing worshippers into the bright air outside, where the Hippodrome stretches in its vast ellipse, its seating capable of holding tens of thousands who came to witness the races and the ceremonies of imperial power. The Theodosian walls stand invisible from here, their bulk hidden by the mass of buildings that has grown against and between them, but their presence shapes every calculation of security and possibility. The golden light of dawn on the copper roofs has become the fuller brightness of late morning as you find yourself again at the harbour, drawn by some unspoken rhythm to the water's edge, where the life of the city most openly displays itself. Ships arriving daily with grain, oil, wine, and goods from across the Mediterranean continue their endless circulation, their sails visible from far out on the Sea of Marmara long before their hulls reach the shelter of the Golden Horn. You watch a vessel from Alexandria being secured to its mooring, its Egyptian crew exchanging greetings with the harbor officials who will assess its cargo and direct its unloading. The grain supply subsidized by imperial arrangement moves from hold to warehouse to distribution point with the efficiency that sustains urban populations beyond the capacity of their immediate hinterlands. The murmur of Greek and Latin in the marketplace continues around you, that characteristic sound of a city that has made bilingualism a condition of its operation, and occasionally the Gothic or Aramaic of foreign residents punctuates the flow like accents in a long-established musical composition. The scent of incense drifts from church doors along the colonnaded thoroughfares even at this hour, the morning liturgies having given way to private devotions and the perpetual presence of sacred fragrance in a city that has dedicated itself to Christian meaning. You understand, standing here, how completely the atmosphere of confidence has permeated every layer of experience, how naturally the citizens of Constantinople in 541 AD assume the permanence of their arrangements and the continuity of their good fortune. Byzantium was founded around 660 BC by Dorian settlers from mainland Greece, and the long endurance of that founding will be tested now, will be measured against what comes, will be proven in ways that no contemporary observer could predict. You feel the sun warm on your shoulders as the morning advances toward noon, and you watch the play of light on the water where ships from every corner of the Mediterranean continue their arrival and departure, their masts like a forest that grows and diminishes with the tides of commerce and war. The policy of Restoratio Imperii has brought these vessels here, has created the conditions of security and demand that animate their voyages. North Africa from the Vandals, much of Italy from the Ostrogoths, these phrases translate into holds of African grain and Italian wine, into the restored circulation of goods that makes possible the restored circulation of power. Justinian's reign, which lasted from 527 to 565 AD, has already encompassed the transformation of possibility into achievement, and the year 541 sits at what appears to be the very apex of this trajectory. You move away from the waterfront again, through streets that grow quieter as the noon hour approaches, and the city retreats into the shade of its porticos and courtyards. The cool darkness of the cisterns beckons once more, and you find yourself descending again into the basilica cistern, into that world of reflected columns and dripping water where the city's life is sustained in visible silence. Water falling from vaulted ceilings drops into the still pool, each ripple spreading and fading with the slowness that marks time in underground places. The city's water supply arrives via aqueducts and underground cisterns, and this particular space, with its hundreds of reused columns and its atmosphere of engineered permanence, represents the confidence that could plan for centuries of continued function. You ascend to the surface and find the streets altered by the fuller light of midday, the shadows shortened and the colors intensified. The bronze gate stands ahead, its administrative functions continuing through the hours with the persistence that marks imperial bureaucracy at every period of its existence. Clerks move between chambers, their scrolls and codices bearing the marks of constant handling, and the corpus juris civilis sits in its copies as the reference point for every decision and every dispute. The legal codification known by that Latin name shapes the possibilities of justice in this Greek-speaking city, the bilingual empire maintaining its Latin roots even as its branches spread in other directions. The Hippodrome, Hagia Sophia, and Great Palace form the ceremonial heart of the city, and you pass among them now, observing the interplay of religious and secular power that characterizes this Christian empire. The dome seeming to float above the great church draws your eye at every approach, its silhouette by now familiar, and yet still capable of surprising you with the boldness of its engineering ambition. Justinian had rebuilt Hagia Sophia in its monumental form after the destruction of the Nika riots, and that reconstruction has become the defining architectural statement of his reign, the physical embodiment of a restored order that transcends mere political recovery. Worshippers continue to gather and disperse, their movements creating patterns of approach and departure that repeat with the regularity of ritual itself. The main thoroughfare carries its traffic with the confidence of long-established function, the paving stones worn by generations of feet and wheels, the colonnades offering shelter from sun and rain. The morning processions have given way to the more dispersed movements of commerce and administration, but the rhythm of the city's life continues with undiminished energy. Multiple harbors along the Golden Horn and Sea of Marmara facilitate the massive maritime trade that sustains this energy, and the ships that you observed at dawn have been joined by others, their numbers swelling with the tide and the favorable wind. You breathe it in, this particular Constantinopolitan atmosphere, and recognize how completely it has shaped the sensory world of these citizens. The murmur of Greek and Latin in the marketplace continues, though the marketplace itself has shifted its character with the advancing day, the morning's wholesale transactions giving way to retail and to the domestic shopping that occupies the hours of leisure. Occasionally Gothic or Aramaic punctuates this flow, the foreign tongues of mercenaries and merchants who have made this city their temporary or permanent home. The cool darkness of the cisterns remains in your memory as you walk, that underground world offering a permanent contrast to the brightness and activity of the surface. The Basilica cistern and its counterparts represent the hidden achievement of this civilization, the infrastructure that makes possible the display and the density above. Water falling from vaulted ceilings has marked the passage of your morning in subterranean spaces, and you carry that rhythm with you as you move through the afternoon streets. The city's density and connectivity, made possible by such engineering, also create the conditions of vulnerability that no one yet recognizes, the networks of contact and exchange that will serve as channels for what approaches. The grain supply, subsidized by imperial arrangement, moves through its established channels, the free distributions to citizens maintaining the social peace that has allowed this commercial energy to flourish. You observe the interaction of official and merchant, of sailor and stevedore, and recognize in their cooperation the practical foundation of imperial confidence. The year is 541 AD, and the reign of Justinian has brought this city to a peak of achievement that will be remembered long after the circumstances of its decline have been forgotten. Byzantine forces have recovered North Africa from the Vandals and much of Italy from the Ostrogoths, and the policy of Restauratio Imperii continues to guide imperial strategy on frontiers distant from this peaceful waterfront. The Theodosian walls stand as guarantee of the landward security that allows maritime expansion, their triple defense system having never yet been tested by the enemies who gather beyond them. You watch the afternoon light begin its long transformation toward evening, the golden tones returning to the copper roofs of the great palace as the sun descends toward the Thracian hills. Worshippers gathering at Hagia Sophia for evening prayer create a flow of movement toward the great church, their numbers swollen by the day's end and the human need for sacred presence at the thresholds of night. The murmur of Greek and Latin in the marketplace softens with the advancing evening, the transactions of commerce giving way to the conversations of domesticity and rest. The scent of incense drifts from church doors with renewed intensity as the liturgical hours return, the evening offices establishing their own atmospheric signature. You move with the flow of citizens toward the spaces of evening gathering, past workshops where silk production has been established, breaking the Persian monopoly that once constrained Roman access to luxury. The shimmer of threads in doorways has given way to shuttered darkness. The industry's daytime display concluded until the next morning's labor. The cool darkness of the cisterns calls to you one final time, and you descend again into the basilica cistern, into that world where water falling from vaulted ceilings measures out a time deeper than the daily cycle of light and labor. You stand among the reflected columns, listening to the slow percussion of falling water, and feel the weight of all that has been built and all that will be tested. The plague would strike just as these achievements seem to promise a restored Roman world, though no voice speaks this in the underground silence. No prophecy disturbs the engineered permanence of falling water and waiting dark. You ascend to find the city entering its evening phase, the streets growing quieter and the lights beginning to show in windows and doorways. The Corpus Juris Civilis sits in its copies, completed in this period of apparent culmination, its systematic ordering of Roman law awaiting the centuries of use and study that will outlast the very empire it serves. The legal codification, known by that Latin name, represents an achievement of intellect and organization that parallels the architectural achievement of the great church and the engineering achievement of the harbors and walls. The ships arriving daily with grain, oil, wine, and goods from across the Mediterranean have completed their unloading, their holds emptied and their manifests checked, and the grain supply, subsidized by imperial arrangement, has moved into storage for tomorrow's distribution. The free distributions to citizens will resume with the morning, maintaining the social contract that has allowed this density of population to persist. The murmur of Greek and Latin in the marketplace has faded to scattered conversations, the occasional Gothic or Aramaic of those who remain abroad in the evening streets. The scent of incense drifts from church doors with the persistence of established practice, the evening offices continuing their cycle of prayer and praise. You stand at the harbor wall where your morning began, your hands again on cool stone worn smooth by generations, and feel the city settling around you into its nightly rhythms. The reign of Justinian, which lasted from 527 to 565 AD, has brought the empire to its apparent height, has pursued the policy of Restauratio Imperii to the recovery of North Africa and much of Italy, has rebuilt Hagia Sophia in its monumental form and established silk production and codified the laws. The Theodosian walls stand as guarantee of landward security, and the city's water supply arrives via aqueducts and underground cisterns, including the Basilica cistern, and the population may have approached 500,000 inhabitants, sustained by subsidized grain and free distributions. You know this, standing at the harbor wall in the gathering dark, and yet the knowledge does not diminish the reality of what surrounds you, the confidence and the achievement and the sheer accumulated weight of human effort that has created this city at its height. The cool darkness of the cisterns waits below, and the dome seeming to float above Hagia Sophia stands against the first stars, and the ships rock gently at their moorings with the promise of tomorrow's commerce. You remain at the water's edge as the stars emerge above the Theodosian walls, as the last lights fade in the workshops where silk production has been established, breaking the Persian monopoly. The Corpus Juris Civilis waits in its copies for tomorrow's consultations, and the bronze gate stands closed against the night, and the hippodrome stretches empty in the darkness where tens of thousands have gathered and will gather again. The ceremonial heart beats more slowly in these hours, yet it beats still, sustained by the same confidence that has carried the city through the day, and that will carry it, for a little longer yet, into the uncertain years ahead. The spring of 542 arrives in Constantinople with a warmth that feels heavier than in other years, and you are standing on the terrace of a house near the Mise as the first rumors move through the morning markets. Procopius of Caesarea, born around 500, has begun his daily observations in a leather-bound tablet, recording what he sees with the same precision he once applied to the campaigns of Belisarius, the general he served as legal advisor and secretary. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of Egyptian grain and Syrian wine, and the harbor sounds carry inland on a breeze that smells of salt and distant rain. The marble facades of the warehouses gleam in the pale light, and the gulls wheel above the Golden Horn with cries that seem sharper than memory recalls them. The sound of lamentation begins in streets that had celebrated imperial victories, and you hear it first from a narrow lane behind the church of St. Theodore, where a woman calls upon the Virgin in a voice that does not sound like prayer, but like announcement. Procopius witnesses the plague in Constantinople and records its progress in detail, moving through the city with his tablet concealed beneath his cloak, noting the first swollen buboes in the groin of a stevedore who collapses against a bollard at the harbor. The cold air moves across your face as you turn toward the great palace, and you notice that the usual crowds around the chalk gate have thinned to scattered knots of whispering officials. The sun climbs slowly above the dome of the Hagia Sophia, and its light falls upon faces that turn away from each other as if contact itself had become dangerous. You are walking now through the Forum of Constantine, where bronze statues stand frozen in attitudes of triumph, and the historian noted that the disease struck without regard to age, sex, or social status, which you can already observe in the diversity of those who have begun to lie upon improvised litters at the edges of public spaces. A senator's litter passes you with its curtains drawn tight, and behind the silk you glimpse the pale hand of an occupant who may already be burning with the fever that Procopius described as the plague's first herald. The smell of vinegar and medicinal herbs burning in doorways reaches you from a house where servants have piled rue and wormwood upon a brazier, and the smoke rises in thin columns that mark infected dwellings like signal fires. The paving stones beneath your sandals are warm from the spring sun, yet you feel a chill that seems to originate not in weather, but in the altered rhythm of the city itself. Procopius writes in his tablet that the disease seemed to spare some households while killing all in others, and you see this mystery enacted before you as you pass a tenement where laughter still rises from an upper window, followed immediately by a house from which bodies are being carried through a side door without ceremony. The historian described symptoms including fever, delirium, and swollen buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck, and now you observe these signs upon a young woman seated upon a doorstep, her head lolling against the frame, while her mother holds a cloth to her forehead and weeps without making sound. The unnatural quiet of streets where commerce has ceased settles over the quarter near the Strategion, where armorers' hammers have fallen silent and the forges glow unattended. You count 7 closed shops where yesterday there were open fronts displaying belts and buckles for the army that Belisarius has led against the Persians. The flickering of lamps in windows where the sick lie untended draws your attention as dusk approaches, and you realize that the physicians have begun to refuse calls, for Procopius recorded that physicians could neither predict nor effectively treat the illness. You are standing at the harbor at dawn on the following morning, and the scene has transformed. The grain ships still ride at anchor, but their cargoes rot in the holds because there are no hands to unload them, and the stevedores who worked these docks now lie in rows upon the quayside, where their comrades have covered them with sailcloth. The historian's own anxiety, as colleagues and neighbors fall ill manifests in his handwriting, which grows smaller and more compressed as the days advance, each letter pressed into the wax with the urgency of one who knows that his own hand may soon be stilled. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes no longer, and the gulls have descended upon abandoned baskets of fish that putrefy in the spring warmth. Victims often died within days, sometimes within hours of showing symptoms, and you watch this compression of mortality in the house of a notary whose name Procopius records among the first wave of the educated dead. The man greeted you at terce with only a slight flush upon his cheeks, and by vespers his body has been carried through streets where the lamentation has become constant and has lost the quality of occasion. You remain in the doorway as his widow burns his documents in a courtyard brazier, not from malice, but from fear that the parchment carries contamination upon its surface. The plague arrived in Constantinople in the spring of 542, and the outbreak in the capital lasted approximately 4 months at its most intense, a period that you are now entering as the days lengthen towards summer. The sight of swollen lymph nodes visible beneath the skin of the afflicted has become commonplace, and you turn your gaze from a child held in its father's arms, the small neck distorted by a bubo that shines with the tightness of overripe fruit. Procopius estimated that at the height of the plague, 10,000 people died daily in Constantinople, and this figure, if accurate even in approximation, implies catastrophic mortality that you can measure in the accumulating silence of streets where dogs roam untended, and the great public fountains run without anyone to fill vessels at their streams. You are walking now through the Forum of Theodosius, where the triumphal column stands witness to vanished armies, and the bas-reliefs of barbarian submission seem to mock the present catastrophe with their imagery of imperial order. The unnatural quiet of streets where commerce has ceased deepens as you move toward the Acropolis, and you notice that the stone has begun to absorb a quality of abandonment that no amount of physical presence can dispel. Procopius now writes of his own household with the same detachment he once reserved for enemy fortifications, noting that 3 of his servants have fallen ill and that his cook has died in the night, without speaking again after evening prayer. The cold air moves across your face as you stand upon a height overlooking the Golden Horn, and the water reflects the scattered lights with a steadiness that seems to belong to another world, another city, another spring. You are standing at the harbor at dawn on a morning when the ships have begun to depart without cargo, their captains choosing the uncertain dangers of open sea over the certain death of this port. The historian compared the mortality to a later outbreak that he specified as occurring 4 months after the first, suggesting that he survived to witness a second wave, though his tablet gives no assurance that he expected such survival. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in a mockery of normal trade, for the goods they handle are the possessions of the dead, sold by desperate heirs for prices that collapse daily as the number of survivors diminishes. The breakdown of normal funeral customs, as deaths overwhelm capacity, becomes visible in the Drypia Gate quarter, where you observe a trench being dug in the necropolis with the hurried care of men who know that their own turn may come before the work is complete. Procopius recorded this collapse of ritual, the abandonment of individual graves in favor of mass interment, that the Church condemns, and the populace accepts with the resignation of those who have seen worse alternatives. You watch a priest anoint a row of bodies with oil that runs across their faces in the rain that has begun to fall, the water diluting the sacrament before it can be properly received. The sound of lamentation rises from a house where a woman has survived her husband and all 6 of her children, her voice rising in a cadence that no longer distinguishes between grief and announcement, prayer and accusation. Procopius noted that the disease seemed to spare some households while killing all in others, and this caprice seems more terrible than uniform destruction, the survival of some standing as reproach to the death of others. The unnatural quiet of streets where commerce has ceased is broken occasionally by the passage of the dead cart, its wheels groaning under loads that would have required multiple beers in the months before the plague. You step aside to let it pass, and the driver does not meet your eyes, as if the condition of his employment has made him untouchable in a sense that precedes and exceeds any medical understanding. Procopius wrote the wars, the buildings, and the secret history, covering Justinian's reign, and in this moment of the plague, he finds the material that will outlast his architectural descriptions, the human catastrophe that gives weight to his political chronicle. The cold air moves across your face as you step finally into the evening, and you breathe deeply as if the outside atmosphere could cleanse what the interior has deposited upon your clothing, your skin, your understanding of what bodies can become. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of memory, the stories of what was purchased and promised in the months before the plague arrived to claim its percentage of every transaction. Procopius observed that some survivors bore marks where buboes had been lanced, and you see these scars upon the neck of a woman who tends a makeshift hospital in the baths of Zeuxippus, her movements efficient with the knowledge of one who has herself passed through the fever and emerged with only these tokens of her ordeal. The unnatural quiet of streets where commerce has ceased acquires a texture that you can almost taste, the silence of Constantinople becoming a substance that fills the spaces where sound once moved with purpose and direction. The outbreak in the capital lasted approximately 4 months at its most intense, and you sense that you are approaching the period when the worst will begin to ease, though the historian's comparison to a later outbreak suggests that this easing is temporary, a false recovery that will be followed by renewed destruction. The sound of lamentation has changed, becoming less individual and more choral, the voices blending into a continuous note that rises from the city like smoke or steam. The cold air moves across your face as you climb toward the Church of the Holy Apostles, and the vast structure seems to hover above the surrounding streets like a promise that has not yet been redeemed, its domes catching the last light as the sun descends toward the Propontes. You remain in the precinct of the church as darkness completes its conquest of the sky, and the stars emerge with a clarity that the diminished smoke of fewer braziers permits. Procopius continues his tablets by lamplight in some room that you cannot locate, his hand still moving across the wax with the determination of one who understands that witness is the only remaining function available to the living. The strange mercy of those who recover, bearing their scars, sustains something in the city that mere survival cannot explain, a continuity of presence that will permit Constantinople to persist beyond this spring, beyond these 4 months, beyond the later outbreak that waits to confirm the first. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of silence, stacking them in the warehouses where grain once waited for a population that has diminished beyond any calculation that the imperial bureaucracy can process. The historian's account forms one of the most detailed contemporary descriptions of any ancient epidemic, and you understand now what this detail cost, the daily exposure to suffering that exacted its own toll upon the observer's spirit. The cold air moves across your face with a freshness that suggests the turning of the season, the approach of summer that will bring some relief from the conditions that have favored the plague's spread. The sound of lamentation persists as an undertone beneath the returning sounds of ordinary life, the hammer and the cartwheel, and the cry of the fishmonger that will never again exist without this shadow beneath them. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes with a slowness that speaks of depleted numbers and depleted expectation. The wealth of Constantinople diminished, but not destroyed. The unnatural quiet of streets where commerce has ceased yields gradually to the noise of restoration. The cart and the mason's chisel and the priest's voice raised in thanksgiving for deliverance that has been partial and may yet prove temporary. You do not enter, for the historian's solitude in these hours is a necessary condition of his craft, the translation of private witnessing into public record. The stars emerge above the Theodosian walls with a brilliance that the diminished smoke of the city permits, and the bronze gate stands closed against the night where it has stood through the worst months of the plague, its metal cool to the touch of the guards who still maintain their posts. The ceremonial heart beats more slowly in these hours, gathering strength for the celebrations that will resume, the imperial processions that will again move through streets where the dead once lay in rows awaiting burial. Procopius witnessed the plague in Constantinople and recorded its progress in detail, and his hand moves still in the lamplight, the stylus pressing words into wax that will be copied onto parchment that will survive the copying of copies, the translation of languages, the interpretation of centuries. The sound of lamentation persists as a memory rather than a present fact, a resonance that will endure in the city's auditory imagination long after the last survivor of this spring has passed into the silence that awaits all who live through history's most terrible passages. The morning air carries the scent of quicklime mingling with decomposition as you walk along the base of the Theodosian walls, where spring blossoms of Judas trees hang in pale mauve clusters above the grey-brown of excavated earth. Around you, the sound of earth being shoveled onto mass graves continues day and night, a rhythm that has replaced the ordinary commerce of this quarter. The grey colour of bodies in the early stages lies visible in open carts, turning darker beneath the unseasonable warmth that hastens what the living cannot prevent. Procopius described bodies being stacked in towers along the city walls, and now you observe the first of these towers being opened, their iron-bound doors forced back by men who rap their faces against what escapes. These defensive structures became improvised mortuaries when the scale of dying exceeded every precedent of plague or siege. The lowest chambers, designed for arrow stores and sleeping quarters for watchmen, receive their first layers of the dead with a haste that admits no ceremony. You watch as corpse-bearers, their wages now commanding sums that would have purchased houses in healthier seasons, drag their burdens through portals never intended for such traffic. The taste of fear in the mouths of those still healthy is something you detect in your own saliva, a metallic sharpness that no well water seems to rinse away. The grey colour of bodies in the early stages has become familiar to those who must handle them, though familiarity breeds no comfort as the turning darker progresses in the stacked heaps. Procopius recorded that all the towers were filled with corpses, then sealed, and you stand witness to the beginning of that sequence, the first tower's lowest chamber already half occupied with forms that yesterday possessed names, occupations, relations to others who now cannot claim them. The emperor ordered these emergency measures when conventional burial became impossible, and his messengers move through streets where the stench of decomposition has become pervasive, announcing that trenches will be dug outside the city walls to receive the dead when towers filled. The normal rituals of death, washing, mourning, proper burial, were abandoned in the first week of May, when the accumulation of unburied dead in church porticos and courtyard corners made mockery of ancient custom. Family members sometimes died together before any could arrange funerals, and you pass a house where 3 bodies await collection, the survivors having perished in the interval between dawn and the arrival of the corpse guard. Slaves and servants, lacking masters to direct them, were left without support in districts where entire households had vanished within a fortnight. The price of bread reportedly rose as bakers and millers died, and the taste of fear in those still healthy is compounded by the hardness of loaves made from inferior grain by unskilled hands. The visual contrast between spring blossoms and the grey-brown of excavated earth strikes you with particular force in the suburban gardens beyond the Golden Gate, where pear trees shed white petals onto mounds of soil rising beside newly dug trenches. The digging of trenches in the suburbs proceeds with military organization that belies the chaos it attempts to contain. You observe laborers, some impressed from the ranks of the surviving poor, others drawn by wages triple the normal rate, working in shifts that continue beneath moonlight when torches permit. The sound of earth being shoveled onto mass graves, day and night, creates an acoustic environment in which sleep becomes difficult even for those whose rooms face inward from the walls. The smell of quicklime mingling with decomposition drifts across the intervening space, a chemical intervention against processes that would otherwise overwhelm the remaining population with pestilential air. Some wealthy individuals died intestate, their property passing to the state in default of heirs who had preceded them to the towers or trenches. The psychological trauma of mass, anonymous burial marked survivors for life, and you recognize its early inscription in the faces of those who must identify the dead by clothing fragments, by rings that resist removal, by the position in which they were last seen alive. The grey color of bodies in the early stages, turning darker as days pass, presents a calendar of mortality that no one wished to learn, yet all now consult in the features of the newly collected. The progression upward through tower levels as space fills proceeds with a mechanical inevitability that you observe over successive mornings. The first tower's lowest chamber, its stone floor still visible when you passed yesterday, now presents a uniform surface of grey limbs arranged with the economy of stacked timber. The second level, reached by iron ladders that corpse-bearers ascend with practiced indifference, receives those who died while the lowest was being prepared. The smell of quicklime mingling with decomposition intensifies as you approach, for lime is thrown in handfuls between layers, a white dusting that settles into the recesses of clothing and the hollows of faces. The emperor eventually offered to pay for proper burials from the treasury, though this promise arrives too late for those already committed to the towers. The stench of decomposition became pervasive in ways that no wind direction seemed to mitigate, and you find yourself breathing through folded cloth, even in districts distant from the walls. From this elevation, the first tower shows its sealed lower portal, its upper window still open to receive more dead. The sound of earth being shoveled onto mass graves rises from multiple points along the suburban horizon, where the trenches were said to hold 70,000 or more bodies in total. This figure, whether accurate or amplified by the horror of those who estimated, conveys something of the scale that individual perception cannot compass. Gravediggers and corpse-bearers commanded high wages, but also perished in numbers that constantly depleted their ranks, and you observe new recruits being instructed in the minimal techniques required, their predecessors having joined the cargo they once transported. The normal rituals of death were abandoned so completely that younger survivors have never witnessed what their grandparents regarded as essential to human dignity. The final sealing of towers, lime thrown over the corpses within, occurs on an afternoon when spring sunlight falls with particular clarity across the stonework. You watch as masons mix mortar with greater care than was applied to the stacking within, for the seal must hold against the pressures of expansion and the curiosity of scavengers. The smell of quicklime mingling with decomposition receives a fresh contribution as sacks are emptied through upper apertures. The white cascade settling into interstices between limbs that will not be disturbed again in living memory. The eerie sight of these structures, standing silent among the living city, impresses itself upon your perception as you descend from the walls and move through streets where commerce resumes in attenuated form. Their restored function as watchposts will carry forever the knowledge of what they contained. The trenches were said to hold 70,000 or more bodies in total, and their filling continues beyond your observation, the sound of earth being shoveled onto mass graves becoming as constant as the flow of a distant river. The stench of decomposition became pervasive in a manner that seemed to penetrate stone and wood, lingering in fabrics that could not be adequately aired, in the grain of furniture that absorbed what the atmosphere carried. You walk past the fifth tower, its lowest chamber already receiving the dead, and calculate that at this rate the circuit will be complete before the summer solstice. The digging of trenches in the suburbs intensifies as tower space diminishes, the two methods of disposal running in parallel that the living might keep pace with the dead. The normal rituals of death were abandoned with a completeness that suggested they had never been essential, though their absence would be mourned for generations in the silence that replaced lamentation. The sound of earth being shoveled onto mass graves modulates as the trenches reach their designated dimensions, the work becoming more of covering than of excavation. You stand at the edge of the largest trench, beyond the Theodosian walls, where the grey-brown of excavated earth forms ramparts that will themselves be levelled when the filling is complete. The smell of quicklime mingling with decomposition rises less strongly here, the open air dispersing what the towers concentrated, though the sheer volume of what lies below communicates itself through the instability of the footing, the settling that continues beneath the surface. The final ceiling of towers proceeds tower by tower as each reaches capacity, a rhythm of closure that you track in your movements along the walls. The first tower, sealed now for a fortnight, presents an exterior indistinguishable from its former appearance, yet bearing within a density of human matter that alters its thermal properties, its acoustic response, its place in the city's imaginative geography. The stench of decomposition became pervasive throughout the city, and then gradually diminished, the olfactory system adapting to what it could not escape, the surviving population becoming anosmic to their own condition. You observe this adaptation in yourself, the ability to pass near the towers without the former revulsion, though intellectual knowledge of what lies within remains undiminished. The sound of earth being shoveled onto mass graves continues as the trenches receive their final layers, the rhythm slowing as the work approaches completion. The smell of quicklime mingling with decomposition will persist longest in the towers, their sealed chambers preserving what the open trenches release to the atmosphere. These towers, normally defensive structures, became improvised mortuaries, and their original function will be restored, watchmen again occupying their upper chambers, though none will sleep easily in spaces so recently devoted to other purpose. The normal rituals of death were abandoned with a haste that suggested they had always been luxury rather than necessity, though their restoration in modified form will be among the first signs of recovered civilization. The digging of trenches in the suburbs will be remembered as the moment when the city's boundary expanded to include these new territories of death, when the distinction between urban and suburban dissolved in the common necessity of disposal. The sound of earth being shoveled onto mass graves will cease, the silence that replaces it carrying its own disturbance, the ear having adapted to a constant that its removal renders uncanny. The final ceiling of towers will be completed in the last days of this season, the masons moving to each remaining aperture with the expertise that repetition has conferred. You observe the last tower receiving its seal, the mortar smoothed with a gesture almost tender, a completion that admits no further addition. The smell of quicklime mingling with decomposition will be sealed with it, preserved in the tower's interior as a chemical record of what occurred, available to any future opening that circumstances might require. The digging of trenches in the suburbs will be commemorated in no monument, the ground itself serving as sufficient memorial, its contours gradually softening with weather and vegetation, until the distinction between trench and surrounding earth becomes imperceptible to any but the most informed eye. You move now through streets where the lamplight again indicates ordinary evening domesticity, where the silence of the towers is not audible but is always present, a bass note beneath the frequencies of resumed life. The smell of quicklime mingling with decomposition will be encountered in other contexts, in building works, in agricultural application, and will carry always this association, this immediate transport to the base of walls where masons sealed what could not be properly mourned. The final sealing of towers will be completed in your presence, and you will turn from it toward the resumed city, the surviving population, the ordinary requirements of bread and sleep and morning light that persist even when the dead have outnumbered the living, even when the towers stand full and silent, even when the trenches hold what no trench was dug to receive. Remembered, the two aspects held in suspension, that is the condition of continued living after history's most terrible passages. You are standing in the corridor outside the imperial bedchamber in the great palace of Constantinople, where the heavy scent of medicinal preparations has settled into the stone like a second atmosphere, thick with juniper and myrrh, and the bitter undertone of ground pearl dissolved in vinegar, the physician's favored remedy for those whose station demands the most expensive suffering. Around you, the muted voices of courtiers drift through passages that seem to narrow with each passing hour, speaking of the emperor's condition in phrases so softened they barely disturb the hanging silence, saying Justinian, saying the year 542, saying the plague has found him now as it has found so many others in this city, where death has become ordinary. The changed light in the palace filters through curtains drawn against observation, turning afternoon into a color you have no name for, something between amber and ash, something that makes the gilded mosaics appear to recede into their own walls. The emperor retreated to his private chambers 3 days past, when the fever first rose in him, and the swellings became visible beneath his jaw and in his armpits, the same buboes that have marked the dying across Constantinople since the spring ships brought the pestilence from Egypt, the same marks that have filled the towers and the trenches beyond the walls where you stood and watched the lime fall. You are moving now through corridors where servants press themselves against the marble to let you pass, their faces half visible in the changed light, their eyes avoiding yours, because to acknowledge another's presence is to acknowledge the possibility of shared breath, shared air, shared fate in this season, when the Emperor Justinian has contracted the plague during the 542 outbreak, and his illness was reported as severe, with expectation that he would die. The silk sheets that will soon cool his fevered skin are being prepared in an inner chamber where no one may enter without the permission of the eunuchs, those guardians of threshold and protocol who continue their ceremonies even as the ceremonies of empire threaten to become obsolete. You find yourself in a larger hall where the court has begun its vigil, though vigil implies a coherence that the gathering lacks. This assembly of senators and soldiers and churchmen who stand in groups that do not mix, who speak in voices that do not carry, who watch each other with the particular calculation of those who have begun to imagine mornings without the emperor's shadow falling across their ambitions. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells reaches you here, muffled by intervening walls yet still distinct, marking hours that seem endless in their passage, each stroke falling into the silence like a stone into deep water. The sound of Hagia Sophia measuring time for a city that has forgotten what time is for when so many perish between one ringing and the next. Justinian had no children, making the succession uncertain, and this fact moves through the hall as visibly as any fever, settling into the posture of the silent men near the bronze doors, into the whispered conferences of those who remember other emperors, other transitions, other moments when the purple stood empty and the strong moved to fill it. The coolness of silk sheets against fevered skin is a sensation you can almost summon, standing here in the outer air, for the physicians have spoken of little else in their comings and goings, describing how the emperor thrashes and sweats, and how his dreams, when he speaks in them, are of conquest and law and the building of churches, the same dreams that have driven the empire across Africa and into Italy and deep into Spain, the same dreams that now seem to contract with each pulse of his infected blood. Theodora, his wife and co-ruler, does not appear to have fallen ill at this time, and this too circulates among the courtiers, this resilience of the empress who rose from the theatrical demimonde to stand beside the throne, who has already survived the Nika riots and the intrigues of nephews and the long resistance of established power, who now moves through the palace with a composure that some read as strength and others as indifference to the fate of the man who made her what she is. You see her once, at a distance, passing through a doorway that closes behind her with the soft finality of a decision not yet announced. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations has begun to seep into adjacent chambers now, and you follow it as others do, not toward any purpose, but because movement is preferable to stillness in a waiting that has no promised end. The muted voices of courtiers in corridors speak of the emperor's condition in terms that shift with each report. Now he is sinking, now he rallies, now the physicians have despaired, now a new physician has arrived with a preparation of crushed emerald that has saved others in Alexandria, or so the merchant who sold it claimed before the plague found him too. The changed light in the palace, filtered through curtains drawn against observation, has begun to darken toward evening, though evening brings no relief from the vigil, no expectation of morning news, only the continuation of suspended time in which Justinian, the year 542, the plague, circulate as the only certain reference in a world that has otherwise lost its bearings. The period of his illness created political instability at the height of the crisis, and you feel this in the changed weight of footsteps behind you, in the sudden absence of officials who were present an hour before and have now withdrawn to test the temperature of other possibilities. The Gothic War in Italy, already stretching imperial resources, continues its distant devouring even as the emperor lies unable to command it, and messengers arrive at the palace with reports that no one dares bring to the sick room, news of cities taken and cities lost, and armies melting into the countryside, where plague follows them as closely as any opposing force. You are standing near a window when one such messenger passes below, his horse lathered and stumbling, his face the grey of those who have ridden through landscapes of the dying, and you understand that the empire does not pause for the illness of its ruler, that the demands of war and administration continue to accumulate like sediment in a stopped river, waiting for the dam to break or to hold. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells marks another hour, and you count them without meaning to 7 strokes, 8, the number seeming important until you forget what you were counting toward. The coolness of silk sheets against fevered skin becomes, in your imagination, almost a refuge, the one comfort available to the emperor in his isolation, though the physician's reports suggest he is beyond comfort, that his delirium recognizes no texture, no temperature, only the phantoms of his unfinished ambitions. Justinian's personal survival could not prevent the broader institutional damage, and this truth settles over the palace like the medicinal scent itself. Inescapable, undeniable, the recognition that even should the emperor rise from his bed, he would rise to an empire already diminished, its treasury depleted by war and plague relief, its population thinned to the point where fields stand unharvested and workshops stand silent, and the great project of reconquest has begun to look like the expenditure of resources that can no longer be replaced. You move through rooms where the changed light has faded to a color that might be called mourning, though no official mourning has been declared, where the gilded mosaics have become mere suggestions of their daytime brilliance, gold becoming gray, becoming black, as the vigil extends into night. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations intensifies, as if the physicians have doubled their efforts in response to some crisis you have not been told of, some turn in the emperor's condition that demands stronger incense, more precious stones ground to powder, the last reserves of imported remedies that have preserved their potency in sealed jars since before the plague came. The muted voices of courtiers in corridors have thinned with the evening, many having withdrawn to their own houses or to the churches where prayers for the emperor's recovery compete with prayers for the dead, for the dying, for the deliverance of the city from what has already descended upon it. Theodora remains within the palace, and those who have seen her speak of a stillness that resembles the stillness of the icons she favors, a painted composure that reveals nothing of what moves beneath it, a face that has learned to survive by offering no purchase to interpretation. You have found your way to a smaller chamber where lamps burn with an oil that smokes and gutters, where a few officials maintain their attendance out of duty or out of the calculation that presence at a deathbed may be remembered by whoever inherits power. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells reaches you more faintly here, as if even sound must struggle to penetrate the layers of palace architecture, the succession of doors and curtains and guarded thresholds that separate the emperor's body from the city that depends upon it. The emperor survived, though the course of his recovery remains unclear, and this knowledge, which you do not yet possess in the hour you inhabit, casts no shadow forward, offers no comfort in the waiting. For in the waiting there is only the waiting itself, the breath held, the gaze fixed upon a door that may open to announce any possibility. The coolness of silk sheets against fevered skin is reported to have become a comfort realized rather than imagined, for in the deepest hour of the night, something shifted in the emperor's condition, some turn that the physicians did not expect and cannot explain, the fever breaking in a sweat that soaked the bedding and required its replacement, the swellings subsiding from their purple distension to a color that suggested healing rather than the final corruption. You learn this not from any announcement, but from the changed quality of movement in the corridors, from the sudden appearance of faces that had withdrawn, from the whispers that now carry a different timbre, not the whisper of death expected, but the whisper of death postponed, of succession preparations that must be set aside, of factions that must retreat to reconsider their positions in a game whose rules have not changed, but whose continuation has been unexpectedly assured. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations begins to dissipate, or perhaps you've simply grown accustomed to it, the way one grows accustomed to any atmosphere that persists long enough, the way the city has grown accustomed to the smell of burning that rises from the funeral pyres, the way the survivors have grown accustomed to spaces emptied of those they knew. The muted voices of courtiers in corridors now speak of recovery, though recovery is a word that covers many possibilities, from the complete restoration of strength to the lingering weakness that transforms a ruler without removing him, That makes every decision an exertion and every public appearance a managed performance. Justinian's survival, when so many perished, was interpreted variously as divine favor or cruel irony. And you hear both interpretations circulating even in these first hours of returned hope, the religious attributing his turn to the intercession of the Virgin, and the skeptics noting that the emperor's continued existence means continued taxation, continued war, continued demands upon a population that might have welcomed rest. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells marks the morning office, and this ringing seems different from the night's endless hours, seems to carry a note of completion, of something ended that may now begin again, though what begins is not what was before. You are moving through corridors that have begun to fill with the ordinary business of palace administration, with messengers who no longer hesitate in doorways, with clerks who resume their copying, with the machinery of empire re-engaging its gears after the interruption of uncertainty. The gradual turn toward recovery, unexpected by his physicians, unfolds across days that you experience as a succession of small revelations. The emperor able to take broth, the emperor asking after documents, the emperor demanding to know the state of the Italian campaign with a persistence that suggests his mind has never left the concerns that defined his reign. You do not enter the sick room, but you stand near enough to hear the reports, near enough to observe the comings and goings of those granted access, the churchmen who come to offer thanks for divine mercy, the generals who come to receive instructions that will carry the war forward despite everything, the architects who come with plans for buildings that will continue to rise as if the plague were merely an interruption and not a transformation. Recovery left Justinian to rule an empire transformed by death, and this transformation is visible in the faces of those who attend him, in the absence of familiar figures who have been replaced by their deputies, in the cautious manner of officials who have learned that proximity to power offers no protection from the power of disease. The coolness of silk sheets against fevered skin gives way to the warmth of woolen coverings as the emperor gains strength enough to object to the constant attendance of physicians, to insist upon the ordinary comforts of convalescence rather than the heroic interventions of desperate medicine. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations is replaced by the more ordinary smells of polished wood and incense, and when the windows are opened, the salt air from the sea that defines the city's existence, the water that brought the plague, and that continues to bring the trade upon which the empire depends. The muted voices of courtiers in corridors resume their normal register, no longer hushed with the expectation of imminent change, though beneath the normalcy runs a current of reassessment, of those who backed wrong horses in the crisis seeking to reposition themselves, of those who remained loyal calculating how to make their loyalty visible to eyes that may now see clearly again. Theodora appears more frequently in the public spaces of the palace, and you observe her in one of the reception halls, receiving a delegation from the church with a formality that acknowledges no interruption, no crisis survived, only the seamless continuation of imperial dignity. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells has become ordinary again, marking the hours of worship that structure the city's day, no longer the endless tolling of emergency, but the regular punctuation of established faith. Yet you notice, because you have been present through the crisis, the slight hesitation in certain gestures, the momentary pause before certain names are spoken, the absence that presence cannot fully disguise. The emperor emerging, visibly aged, to address a diminished court is a scene you witness from the edge of the great reception hall, standing among those whose rank permits attendance but not proximity. Justinian moves slowly, supported by attendants who are themselves careful not to seem to support him, his face thinner than the images that circulate in his name, his voice softer, but still carrying the distinctive accent of his Illyrian origins, the Latin cadences that marked him as provincial even after decades of rule. He speaks of the plague as a trial sent by God, of the empire's endurance as evidence of divine purpose, of the continued necessity of the Gothic War and the other campaigns that define his reign, and you observe the court's response, the careful balance of enthusiasm and restraint, the awareness that this emperor has returned from a threshold that few cross back from, that his survival marks him in ways that his subjects are still learning to read. He continued to reign for 23 years after the plague, until 565, and this future stretches before him as he stands before his court, invisible yet determined, the long continuation of a rule that will outlast many of those who witness this first emergence. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations has faded entirely from the palace's atmosphere, replaced by the ordinary perfumes of court life, the frankincense that accompanies ceremonies, the rose water that scents the hands of attendants, the subtle identification of power with fragrance that persists in all seasons. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells marks the hour of your departure from this scene, the gradual movement of your attention toward other chambers, other witnesses, other moments in the long aftermath of catastrophe. The coolness of silk sheets against fevered skin becomes memory rather than present sensation, the memory of a crisis that has passed into the narratives that will be constructed around it, the official story of divine preservation and the unofficial stories of what occurred in the hours when the emperor seemed certain to die. Some historians question whether his later policies were affected by his experience of the disease, and you hear this question being asked in the years that follow, in the increasingly ambitious building programs, the more insistent religious orthodoxy, the peculiar combination of energy and exhaustion that characterizes the long final phase of Justinian's reign. You are standing in the great courtyard as the emperor moves toward the chapel, his pace steady now, but still deliberate, still requiring the attention that convalescence demands from those who would pretend to full strength. Around you, the diminished court arranges itself in formations that suggest continuity, the same officials in the same robes performing the same obeisances, yet the diminishment is real, the empty spaces where plague removed its chosen victims, the new faces that have not yet learned the subtle choreography of imperial proximity. The emperor's survival meant continuity, but also meant presiding over decline, and this double meaning attaches itself to his figure as he pauses at the chapel door, as he turns to acknowledge the assembled court with a gesture that contains both gratitude and command, both the awareness of what has been survived and the determination to continue as if survival were itself sufficient achievement. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations has become, in the months that follow, a reference point for those who wish to emphasize the extremity of the crisis, the physician's own accounts growing more dramatic with each retelling, the preparations more exotic, the emperor's condition more desperate, until the story of the illness threatens to eclipse the fact of recovery in the economy of court memory. The muted voices of courtiers in corridors have moved on to new subjects, to the marriage of this official, the death of that general in Italy, the constant replenishment of gossip that fills the spaces between events of genuine significance. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells continues its regular marking of hours that pass with renewed speed, the empire resuming its temporal rhythm after the suspension of crisis, the days accumulating into weeks and months and years in which the plague becomes one episode among many, one challenge survived among the continuous challenges of rule. The coolness of silk sheets against fevered skin, recedes into the private memory of the emperor himself, inaccessible to the historians who will construct their narratives from documents and from the testimony of those who stood outside the sick-room door. Procopius, in the Secret History, would later criticize Justinian's response to various crises, and you consider this future judgment as you observe the emperor in his recovered public role, the energy that seems forced, the attention that seems to wander at moments to private concerns that the court cannot share, the strange combination of presence and absence that characterizes those who have returned from serious illness to demands that do not acknowledge their transformation. You find yourself in the streets outside the palace, moving through a city that has resumed its ordinary appearance despite the empty houses, the closed shops, the altered composition of a population that has lost perhaps a quarter of its number in the months of plague. The continuation of rule in a city where death has become ordinary is the condition you now inhabit, the emperor's survival having restored the framework of authority without restoring the density of life that preceded the pestilence. Vendors sell bread from diminished stocks. Craftsmen accept commissions from reduced clientele. Priests conduct funerals with the efficient regularity of those who have performed too many to maintain the full ritual of individual mourning. The distant sound of the cathedral's bells reaches you here in the open air, mingled with the cries of gulls and the creak of cartwheels, and all the ordinary sounds of a port city that continues because continuation is what cities do, what empires do, what human arrangements persist in doing until some greater force prevents them. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations has left no trace in these public spaces, has been absorbed into the larger smell of a city that burns its dead and cleanses its streets, and resumes the commerce that makes survival economically possible, if not spiritually comprehensible. The muted voices of courtiers in corridors have given way to the louder voices of market negotiation, of argument and greeting, and the ordinary insults that constitute social life in its unguarded moments. Justinian, the year 542, the plague, circulates still as reference points, as the shared vocabulary of a generation that will define itself by having survived this convergence of disease and war and the exhaustion of long ambition. You are moving toward the harbor now, where ships arrive with grain from Egypt and with the silks and spices that justify the empire's commercial existence, where sailors move with the particular freedom of those who belong to no land and therefore fear no plague that land can hold. The heavy scent of medicinal preparations has dissipated entirely now, has become a story told about a room that will be used for other emperors, other illnesses, other crises of succession that will unfold in their own time, according to their own logic. The muted voices of courtiers in corridors have been replaced by the silence of your own departure, the footsteps that carry you through gates and across courtyards, and into the streets where the city continues its diminished but persistent life. Justinian survived, and this knowledge attaches itself to your understanding of the events you have witnessed, the uncertainty that remains about whether his recovery was miracle or mere chance, whether the empire benefited or suffered from the continuation of his rule, whether the story you carry with you is one of hope or of the postponement of an ending that history will eventually require. The harbor opens before you, the water darkening toward evening, the ships at anchor rocking with the motion of tides that have carried plagues and silks and armies across the centuries, and you move toward them, toward the next passage, toward the continuation that is the only form of meaning available to those who survive. The plague spread throughout the late antique Mediterranean world, reaching North Africa, Italy, Gaul, and Spain, and you are walking through the gate of a provincial estate somewhere in the Egyptian countryside, The year perhaps 542 or 543, the exact date already uncertain in local memory. The iron hinges groan as you pass beneath the stone arch, and before you stretches a landscape of absence, of fields where half the field hands have died, and the harvest rots where it stands. The smell of unharvested grain rotting in autumn rains greets you first, a sweet, dense corruption that hangs in the motionless air, and you notice how the wheat that once stood in ordered rows now leans in tangled profusion, gold darkening to brown, then to the black of fungal bloom. Around you, the irrigation channels run with murky water unattended, their sluice gates jammed open or broken shut, and the ditches that once carried the measured abundance of the Nile now spill across paths and into hollows where no one walks to mend them. The wind moves through these fields with a voice you have heard before in other desolate places, rattling the dry heads of grain, stirring the reeds along the canal banks where herons stand motionless and fat. You are standing at the edge of a field that extends toward the horizon, and the quality of light in this half-empty world seems to flatten distances, to make every object appear both closer and less substantial than it should be, as though the atmosphere itself has thinned with the departure of so many souls. The silence of a village, where only a few inhabitants remain, reaches you from beyond the next rise, where perhaps a dozen souls persist where 50 once lived, and you understand that this estate, this nameless property attached to some distant landowner's portfolio, has become a wound in the body of empire, a place where the economic base of the ancient city, with its reliance on surrounding agricultural territory, is being undermined in the very moment of your observation. Now you see what that spreading meant in one particular place, the translation of statistics into stalks of grain no hand will gather. The sun has moved to its midday height, and the heat presses down upon the rotting fields with a weight that seems almost deliberate, almost conscious of your presence as a witness. You walk along a raised path between two plots, and the mud beneath your feet holds the print of sandals that passed perhaps days ago, perhaps weeks, the edges already softening in the moisture that seeps from the neglected channels. A lizard darts from the shade of a fallen sheaf, and the movement startles you in the stillness, for life here has become so sparse that every living thing registers as an event, a small defiance of the prevailing emptiness. The fields growing wild where wheat once stood in ordered rows surround you on every side now, and you notice how nature reasserts itself not in dramatic reclamation, but in patient incremental encroachment, the wild sorrel and dock threading through the cultivated grain, the bindweed wrapping its pale, stems around stalks that no sickle will sever. That odor of rotting grain returns, carried on a breeze that has shifted direction, and you understand that this smell will linger for months, for years perhaps, in the memory of those who survive, a sensory anchor for loss that no rhetoric of recovery can dissolve. Something of the acoustic strangeness you will later encounter in emptied cities obtains even here in the open country, where the absence of human voices seems to amplify the buzz of insects, the splash of a frog, the distant cry of a bird of prey circling somewhere beyond your sight. You are walking through one small portion of that reach, one fragment of a catastrophe that has rendered the familiar world unrecognizable. You come upon a threshing floor of packed earth, its surface already cracked and seeded with volunteer grain that has fallen and sprouted in the confusion of abandonment. The wooden tools lie where they were dropped, the flails crossed like bones, the winnowing fans propped against a wall that supports no roof, for the shelter that once covered this working space has collapsed in some wind or simply decayed from lack of maintenance. The silence presses upon you here, for the threshing floor was a place of communal labor, of voices calling in rhythm, of the distinctive percussive music of grain beaten from husk, and now its muteness speaks as loudly as any anthem. The sound of wind through empty streets where commerce has ceased is still distant from your experience, still a phenomenon of the cities you have not yet reached. Yet you begin to understand that the countryside and the city are being drawn into a single condition, a unified field of diminishment that recognizes no boundary between field and forum. You are beginning to comprehend the scale of that spread, the way a single narrative of disease has inscribed itself across landscapes as various as this Egyptian estate and the distant mountains of Tuscany, the river valleys of Gaul, the coastal plains of Andalusia. Tax revenues declined precipitously with the loss of taxpayers, and somewhere in the records of this estate, in the accounts kept by a steward who may himself be dead, the arithmetic of disaster is being calculated, the subtraction of names from ledgers, the conversion of productive land to waste. The afternoon has begun to lengthen, and the light that falls across the abandoned fields takes on a thickness, a golden viscosity, that seems to slow your movements as you continue your walking. You pass a well, its rope still threaded through the windlass, the bucket overturned beside it, and you look down into the darkness of water that reflects nothing but a circle of darkening sky. The smell of rotting grain has faded, replaced by the sharper scent of vinegar from this abandoned wine, and you understand that the sensory landscape of empire is being remade, that future generations will inherit a world whose odors and textures bear the imprint of this moment of collapse. You are walking through the material consequence of that spread, through the proof that historical events are never merely abstract, but always manifest in the particular weight of a bucket left overturned, the particular angle of a trellis fallen from its supports. Population losses severely affected agricultural production across the empire, and here that severity reveals itself in the rust upon a pruning hook, the moss upon a storage jar left open to the elements, the gradual dissolution of everything that human care had maintained against the constant pressure of entropy. The estate's main buildings appear before you as the sun descends toward the western horizon, a complex of mud brick and stone that once housed the steward and his staff, stored the harvest, processed the agricultural surplus into the commodities that sustained distant markets. Now the courtyard gates stand open, unguarded, and you pass through into a space where the whisper of air through a colonnade where no feet walk, the rustle of pigeons nesting in the rafters of a granary that holds no grain, announce the rural analogue of urban desolation. The quality of light in a half-empty city, sounds carrying strangely, approaches here as the sunset reddens the western sky and the shadows lengthen across the courtyard pavement. For in this emptied space, even your own footsteps seem to echo with a resonance disproportionate to their actual sound, as though the buildings themselves have become attuned to absence, have begun to amplify the signs of departure. You understand that this estate, this anonymous property, has become a type of the larger transformation, a microcosm of the empire's contraction into a smaller, poorer, more desperate version of itself. Night falls with the swiftness characteristic of these latitudes, and the stars emerge in profusion above the ruined productivity of the estate. You have found shelter in a corner of the portico, wrapping yourself in a cloak that was perhaps left behind in the flight of some final departure, and you listen to the sounds of a landscape returning to something like its prehuman state. The cooler scents of night have replaced the day's corruption, of dew gathering on untended vegetation, of the distant river carrying its eternal burden of silt toward the sea. In the darkness, you rehearse the extent of the catastrophe as a kind of mantra, a way of locating yourself within a disaster that exceeds any single vantage, any individual experience of loss. Rural areas suffered depopulation as survivors fled or died, and you understand that the flight and the dying are not alternatives, but phases of a single process. The emptying of the countryside that precedes and enables the emptying of the cities, the collapse of the agricultural base that undermines the urban superstructure built upon it. Dawn comes with a pale luminosity that seems to rise from the earth itself rather than descend from the sky, and you are walking again, leaving the estate behind, following a road that leads toward the nearest city, toward the urban world that is also your destination. The road is rutted where carts have passed and not been maintained, and in places the paving stones have been pried up for some more immediate use, leaving gaps where water pools and mud gathers. You are walking through the intermediate zone between rural and urban collapse, through the geography of a civilization that is learning to make do with less, to expect less, to inhabit a diminished present without the consolation of a plausible future. By midday, you have reached the outskirts of a small city, a provincial center whose name you do not know and whose identity has perhaps already begun to blur with 100 similar places across the afflicted territories. The streets before you present the spectacle of shops that stand empty, their owners buried in a common trench somewhere beyond the walls, and you walk past the open doorways where goods once displayed now lie scattered, deteriorating, or have been removed entirely in the panic of departure or the methodical stripping by survivors. You are now witnessing the urban dimension of that spread, the translation of rural death into urban desolation, the way a city dies not all at once, but in the cumulative effect of individual absences, of enterprises that find no successor, of skills that pass with their last practitioner. The afternoon finds you in what was once the commercial heart of this diminished place, a colonnaded street where the arcades still cast their shade, but few walk beneath their protection. The smell of unharvested grain rotting in autumn rains has been replaced here by other olfactory signatures of abandonment. The mustiness of goods left to decay in closed rooms, the faint corruption of water standing in cisterns untended, the universal odor of dust settling upon surfaces that no hand will disturb. You are walking through one of its urban victims, through a place that will perhaps recover something of its former density, or will not, will remain in its diminished state as a monument to the fragility of civic life. You come upon a church, its doors standing open as though in permanent invitation, and within you find a few figures engaged in the offices of a liturgy that continues despite the reduction of its congregation. The faith that sustained communities through this catastrophe found its expression in spaces like this, in the stubborn persistence of ritual when the social body that had supported it had been so severely diminished. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean for centuries were disrupted, and you understand that this church, this city, this entire region are nodes in a network that has begun to fray, to lose its coherence, to become a collection of isolated points rather than a functioning system of exchange and mutual dependence. Evening approaches, and you have found a corner of the portico where a few citizens gather to share what food and news remain in this contracted world. They discuss the imperial tax collector finding villages abandoned, records meaningless, and you understand that the fiscal apparatus of empire has become a mechanism for registering loss, for attempting to extract from the diminished present the revenues that the more populous past had provided. The tax registers that once mapped the productive capacity of these territories now describe a landscape of absence, of names crossed through, of figures that have become fictions, demands upon resources that no longer exist. The smell of unharvested grain rotting in autumn rains returns to your memory, summoned by this discussion of agricultural failure, and you understand that the sensory and the administrative are continuous, that the odor of a single field and the arithmetic of a provincial ledger are aspects of a single transformation. Night has fallen, and you are walking again, leaving this city by a gate that no one guards, following a road that leads toward the frontier, toward the military installations that protect the empire's edges and project its power into the territories beyond. The army found recruitment difficult as the pool of able-bodied men shrank, and this difficulty manifests in the reduced numbers of the camp you enter, in the spaces between tents that once stood closer together, in the aging of the soldiers who remain, their faces marked by service that has extended beyond the normal term because no replacements could be found. The morning reveals the full extent of this military diminishment as you walk through the camp and observe the routines of a force attempting to maintain its capabilities with inadequate resources. An army camp where recruits are scarce and veterans demand higher pay is not merely a military problem, but a symptom of the larger transformation, the way demographic catastrophe translates into institutional crisis, the way a state that had seemed eternal discovers its dependence upon the biological continuity of its population. The day passes in observation of these military routines, the attempts to maintain order and capability in conditions of scarcity, and you notice how the camp's inhabitants have developed their own adaptations to the new circumstances. The smell of unharvested grain rotting in autumn rains is absent here, replaced by the more disciplined odors of military cooking, of leather and bronze, and the sweat of men engaged in physical training. Yet the underlying condition of shortage persists in the reduced rations, the complaints of soldiers who feel their service undercompensated, the tension between the demands of command and the capacity of a diminished force. Evening brings a council of officers, and you observe from the margins as they discuss the impossibility of their situation, the demands from the center for troops that cannot be raised, the need to defend frontiers that stretch beyond the capacity of the reduced force. The pandemic is considered the largest ancient epidemic across this vast geographical range precisely because it touched every aspect of organized life, because it left no institution untouched, no region unmarked, no future unaltered by its passage. You leave the camp in the darkness before dawn, returning toward the settled lands, and the journey occupies days of walking through landscapes that present variations on the theme of abandonment and adaptation. You are walking through the geography of this largest ancient epidemic, through the evidence of its reach and its uneven effects, for some regions recovered more slowly than others, creating new inequalities that would shape the future development of the Mediterranean world. Abandoned farms reverted to scrub or were absorbed into larger estates, and you pass boundaries where the signs of this process are visible, where the smallholder's plot has become part of a larger domain, where the free peasant has given way to the tied laborer, where the economic independence that had characterized much of the empire's rural population has been compromised by the necessities of survival. The Silk Road connections that brought prosperity also facilitated disease spread, and you understand this paradox most fully when you reach a trading station where the eastward and westward routes converge, where the goods of distant continents have been exchanged, and with them the pathogens that now circulate in every direction. You are standing at the harbor of Constantinople in the spring of 544, and the air carries a different quality than it has in recent memory. The ships that once lay abandoned at their moorings are now being loaded with grain and wine and the preserved goods of commerce. Around you, the merchants speak in voices that have recovered some measure of ordinary confidence, for the emperor's officials have declared the plague extinguished throughout the Eastern Roman Empire, and this declaration has been received with the gratitude of a population that has buried more of its own than it cares to remember. The cold morning moves across your face with the salt breath of the sea, and you watch as a crew hauls a net of silver fish onto the quay, their scales catching the pale light like scattered coins. The sound of their work is rhythmic and unhurried, and somewhere nearby a woman is singing a song about returning fishermen that you have not heard in the streets for many years. The stone beneath your feet holds the warmth of yesterday's sun, and the harbour smells of pitch and rope, and the particular freshness of water that has travelled from distant shores. The cautious hope of 544 settles over the city like a thin veil of mist that might lift at any moment or might remain until noon. You notice how the survivors move through the streets with a certain lightness in their step, how the workshops have reopened, and the churches have filled again with those who wish to give thanks for deliverance. The demographic depression remains visible in the empty houses and the overgrown gardens of families that will not return. Yet commerce resumes a long path that the plague had severed, and the grain ships from Egypt are arriving once more with their essential cargoes. The particular anxiety of spring has not entirely dissipated, for the disease most often returned in these months when the earth renewed itself. But the declaration of 544 AD offers a boundary that many wish to believe is permanent. You pass through a market where the stalls display copper vessels and dyed linens and the preserved fruits of last autumn's harvest, and the bargaining that rises around you possesses the ordinary music of a world attempting to forget. The visual memory of earlier outbreaks is preserved in the survivors' minds like sediment at the bottom of a cleared stream, invisible yet present in every current. You see it in the way an elderly woman pauses before entering a crowded doorway, in the hesitation of a father who has lost children and now watches his remaining offspring with a vigilance that borders on prayer. The changed quality of hope manifests in small rituals of protection, in the amulets that hang from doorways and the particular herbs that have gained renewed significance in household medicine. The gradual normalization of vigilance has already begun, a low hum of apprehension that underlies the returning commerce like the drone of a distant machine that never quite falls silent. The harbour at dawn, Constantinople, the year 544 AD. These coordinates mark a moment of fragile restoration, and you feel the weight of what has been rebuilt as you walk the restored streets where the dead once lay unburied in their thousands. A man weighing spices on a brass scale tells you of caravans that have turned back at the first report of illness, of contracts that now include clauses for plague-related cancellation, of the new mathematics of risk that every trader must calculate. The sound of coughing in a neighboring house triggers the familiar fear before you can consciously name it, and you notice how the merchant's hand stills for a fraction of a moment before completing his measurement. The plague became endemic in the Mediterranean region for an extended period, and even in this season of declared victory, the knowledge of its persistence circulates like another invisible currency. 13 years pass with the irregular rhythm of a heart that has suffered damage and now beats with occasional arrhythmia. You are walking through the same harbour in the spring of 557 AD when the first reports begin to circulate, and the shock of recognition passes through the crowd like a cold wind preceding a storm that will not pass. The disease flared up again in 557 AD, beginning a pattern of recurring outbreaks that would define the experience of generations yet unborn, and you watch as the familiar symptoms reappear in a new generation that has grown to adulthood in the interval of false peace. A young woman at a well describes her brother's fever, the swelling that has appeared in his groin, the dark patches on his skin that the older among you recognize with terrible certainty. The particular anxiety of spring intensifies as the days lengthen and the disease most often returned in these months, when the earth renewed itself, and the ships brought more than commerce across the waters. You observe how the population of Constantinople divides between those who remember 542 and those who were born since, how the demographic depression perpetuates itself by carrying away those born since the last outbreak, maintaining demographic depression across the decades like a scythe that returns to the same field with each new growth. The visual memory of earlier outbreaks preserved in survivors' minds now finds terrible confirmation, and you see in their faces the particular horror of recognition, of a nightmare that was believed to have ended and now proves itself endless. The harbor at dawn, Constantinople, the year 557 AD. These coordinates mark not a new beginning, but a dreadful repetition, and the goods that lie rotting on the quay will not be traded this season, or perhaps for many seasons to come. The diseases return in 557 coincided with other natural disasters, including earthquakes that shook the foundations of buildings already weakened by neglect and death, and you feel the tremor beneath your feet as you make your way through streets where the pavements have cracked and the aqueducts have spilled their precious water into the dust. The combination of plague and earthquake further damaged Constantinople's infrastructure, and you pass through districts where the ruins of the second disaster lie heaped upon the ruins of the first, where the living shelter in structures that threaten collapse with every aftershock. The low hum of apprehension that underlies all activity rises now to a more audible pitch as the population confronts the truth that their world has become multiply precarious, that the protections of walls and institutions can be undone by forces that acknowledge no human boundary. Later 6th century emperors, including Justin II and Tiberius II, faced this persistent threat as a condition of their reign rather than an emergency to be overcome. And you stand in the great church where Justin II has come to pray for deliverance from a scourge that has outlasted his uncle Justinian, who gave the plague its enduring historical name. The emperor's face is lined with a fatigue that transcends personal weariness, and you understand that the recurrent nature of the disease prevented full economic and demographic recovery, that each generation must begin again from a diminished foundation, that the accumulated wealth and knowledge of centuries dissipates like water poured onto sand. The changed quality of hope manifests in Justin II's prayers, which no longer ask for permanent relief, but rather for the strength to endure until the next interval of peace. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, possibly smallpox, had been devastating but not recurrent in the same way, and you understand as you listen to the scholarly discussion in a monastic library that the plague's endurance distinguishes it from more isolated ancient epidemics, that the Justinianic plague established Yersinia pestis as a persistent presence in Europe and the Mediterranean in a manner unprecedented in recorded history. A monk copying a medical treatise pauses to describe how his order has preserved records of each outbreak, how the intervals between visitations have been measured and found irregular, how the hope of permanent extinction has given way to the more modest goal of preparation. The particular anxiety of spring has become a permanent feature of the monastic calendar, and the brothers pray with special intensity when the season turns and the ships resume their voyages. The low hum of apprehension has found its expression in the architecture of survival, in the isolated pest houses and the protocols for handling the dead that now constitute a standard element of urban planning. You move through the decades with the uneven pace of historical narration, and the irregular outbreaks continued until after 770 AD, more than 2 centuries of recurrence that shaped the transition from late antiquity to the early medieval period, in ways that the participants could not fully comprehend. The endemic establishment of plague represents a fundamental ecological shift in the Mediterranean world, and you observe this shift in the altered landscape of agriculture, in the abandoned fields that have returned to forest, in the diminished cities that contract within walls that once enclosed thriving suburbs. The 8th century outbreak, 2 centuries after the first, still carried the name of a long-dead emperor, and you stand in a village where the peasants speak of the Plague of Justinian, as if the emperor himself were somehow present in their suffering, as if the historical distance between his reign and their own had collapsed in the face of this returning horror. The changed quality of hope manifests in their resignation, in the acceptance that the disease has become a permanent feature of life, like winter or the rising of the sea, to be endured rather than defeated. The particular anxiety of spring retains its power even now, and the village elders watch the roads with a vigilance that their great-grandparents would have recognized, waiting for the first reports that will confirm the pattern once again. The low hum of apprehension has become so thoroughly embedded in the rhythms of existence that you struggle to imagine what consciousness would feel like without it, what it meant to live in the centuries before 542, when the Mediterranean world had not yet learned this particular grammar of fear. Later outbreaks were attributed apocalyptic significance by contemporary writers, and you read in a chronicle composed during one of the later visitations how the author interprets the disease as a sign of the approaching end of all things, how the persistence of plague across 2 centuries has convinced him that the world itself is passing away. The harbor at dawn, Constantinople, the long stretch of years from 544 to 770 and beyond. These coordinates mark a transformation of human experience that exceeds the simple accumulation of deaths. The recurrent nature prevented full economic and demographic recovery, and you observe in the material record how the pottery becomes rougher, how the buildings smaller, how the very ambition of human construction diminishes under the weight of repeated catastrophe. The slow, incomplete adaptation of institutions to this new reality unfolds across the decades, with the hesitant rhythm of organisms attempting to evolve in response to altered conditions. You observe how the military recruitment changes to accommodate diminished populations, how the tax system adjusts to the reality of abandoned land, how the church assumes responsibilities that the weakened state cannot sustain. The particular anxiety of spring shapes the calendar of administration, and officials delay important decisions until the season of greatest danger has passed, building a structural hesitation into the very operation of government. The changed quality of hope manifests in the institutions themselves, in the hospitals that have become permanent features of urban life, in the quarantine regulations that are now codified rather than improvised, in the recognition that some preparations must be maintained even in the intervals between visitations. The long duration of plague presence shaped the transition from late antiquity to the early medieval period in ways that extended far beyond the simple fact of mortality. And you understand this most fully when you compare the Mediterranean world of 540 with that of 750, when the same pathogen still circulated and the same fear still accompanied the turning of the seasons. This endemic establishment of plague represents a fundamental ecological shift in the Mediterranean world, and this shift is visible in the altered relationship between city and countryside, in the diminished role of long-distance commerce, in the localization of economic and political life that would characterize the early medieval centuries. The low hum of apprehension has become a structural feature of this transformed world, and you recognize in the fortified villages and the dispersed settlements, a physical expression of the knowledge that concentration brings vulnerability, that the connections that enable prosperity also facilitate the spread of death. The harbour at dawn, Constantinople, the year 544 AD, when the plague was declared extinguished in the Eastern Roman Empire, and the harbour at dawn, Constantinople, the year 557 AD, when the disease flared up again, beginning a pattern of recurring outbreaks. These moments bracket an experience of historical time that has lost its linear promise, that has become instead a cycle of emergency and partial recovery, of hope and its repeated disappointment. You stand finally in the changed landscape of the 8th century, where the name of Justinian still attaches to a disease that has outlasted his empire's greatest expansion, where the particular anxiety of spring has become a permanent feature of consciousness, where the sound of coughing in a neighboring house triggers the familiar fear with an immediacy that 2 centuries have not diminished. The changed quality of hope manifests in the acceptance that has gradually replaced expectation, in the wisdom of those who have learned to build without certainty, to plant without assurance of harvest, to bear children without confidence that they will survive to bury their parents. The low hum of apprehension that underlies all activity in this transformed world has become indistinguishable from the ordinary texture of existence, and you understand in the final moments of your observation that the plague's greatest victory lies not in the deaths it has caused, but in the consciousness it has created, in the perpetual anticipation of loss that now accompanies every attachment, every investment, every hope for the future. The harbour at dawn, the spring air, the particular anxiety that moves with the returning ships. These sensory anchors bind you to the experience of generations who lived and died in the long shadow of recurrence, who adapted without recovering, who endured without overcoming, who shaped a world in the image of their diminished but persistent hope. You are standing on a hill above Constantinople in the year 565, and the evening light falls across a city that has known both triumph and diminishment. The golden domes of the Hagia Sophia catch the last radiance of a sun descending toward the Thracian plain, and you feel the cool air moving across your face as the day releases its warmth into the darkening sky. Around you, the terrace gardens show patches where vines and olive trees have been left untended, spaces where laborers once moved with purpose through the lengthening afternoons. The sound that reaches you is thinner than it would have been a generation before, fewer voices rising from the harbour side, less constant the clatter of commerce along the Meuse. Constantinople in 565 remains the greatest city in the Mediterranean world, yet you sense in this hour the particular quality of a place that has passed through something it does not speak of directly, a city whose magnificence now exists in tension with absence. The smell of scrub and wild growth reaches you from the slopes beyond the walls, vegetation reclaiming ground where once intensive cultivation fed the appetites of a larger population. You trace with your eyes the line of the Theodosian walls, that vast fortification system built for a different scale of threat and prosperity, and you notice how the spaces between the towers hold a different density of human presence than their builders anticipated. The texture of the world has become smaller in ways the eye cannot always measure, distances longer in the experience of those who must travel them, connections fewer between places that once traded goods and news with regular ease. This is the Constantinople that Justinian leaves behind at his death, the emperor whose vision of a restored Roman dominion stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the Persian frontier, whose armies conquered North Africa from the Vandals and Italy from the Ostrogoths, whose codification of Roman law still shapes the legal imagination of the Mediterranean. The Justinianic plague, contributed indirectly to the failure of Justinian's Restoratio Imperii, though the connections between disease and political collapse unfold across decades rather than days, visible to hindsight rather than to contemporaries. You turn from the imperial capital and begin a journey westward through landscapes that the plague has marked in ways both visible and submerged. The roads that carried Roman administration for centuries now pass through villages where half the houses stand empty, their doors weathered to grey, their gardens grown to bramble and thorn. The sound of a reduced population follows you, less constant the human noise that once animated these routes, the laughter of children more intermittent where settlements have contracted toward their cores. You feel the texture of a world that has become smaller with each day's travel, the distances between functioning communities lengthened by the absence of those who once filled the intermediate spaces. The smell of scrub and wild growth reclaiming former farmland accompanies you through valleys where terraces have cracked and slipped, where olive groves planted by grandparents now send up suckers from rootstocks left untended. The cities you enter tell variations of a single story, their forums still grand in conception, but diminished in daily use. You walk through streets where porticos shelter fewer merchants, where the water of public fountains runs without the press of bodies that once surrounded them. The evening light on these urban landscapes reveals architecture designed for larger congregations, spaces that now accommodate the ghosts of greater numbers. The reconquest of Italy, already difficult, was further complicated by plague-related troop losses and revenue decline, and you see in the half-empty barracks and reduced garrisons the material expression of a military overstretch that disease made fatal. The ancient world's integrated trade networks, already strained by the long wars of reconquest, were transformed into more localized systems, and you notice in the markets fewer imported goods from distant provinces, more reliance on what regional production can supply. The boundary between antiquity and the medieval period, never sharp, was blurred further by this prolonged crisis, and you find yourself moving through a landscape where categories dissolve into lived experience. The demographic collapse differentiated the late antique Mediterranean from the medieval one that followed, a transformation visible in the shrunken footprints of cities, the abandoned villas in their hinterlands, the reduced shipwrecks in coastal waters. You touch the stone of a warehouse built for volumes of commerce that no longer arrive, feeling the particular cold of masonry that has known better days. The genetic legacy of Yersinia pestis biovar antiqua persisted in rodent populations across these regions, with later medieval plague representing a different biovar, a separate evolutionary trajectory that would revisit these same landscapes with the Black Death of the 14th century. The silence of ruins that had been bustling towns within living memory becomes its own kind of presence, a negative space that defines the acoustic environment through what it withholds. You descend toward Italy through mountain passes where the snow lingers into late spring, and the quality of evening light on the slopes reveals pastures that have extended where grain fields once dominated, a shift in land use that follows the reduction of labor available for intensive cultivation. The sound of a reduced population is profound in these high valleys, where the bells of isolated chapels replace the more frequent calls to prayer from village churches that have lost their congregations. The Lombard invasion of Italy in 568 succeeded partly due to Byzantine weakness after the plague, and you sense in the nervousness of the border officials, in the patched-together nature of the garrisons, the vulnerability that a newly arrived barbarian confederation would exploit. The Lombards find a peninsula exhausted by war and disease, and you observe their arrival not as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual permeation of people seeking land and opportunity in a landscape that offers both in altered proportion. You stand among them as they move through the Tuscan hills, their horses picking their way between abandoned farmsteads, their warriors noting the defensive possibilities of hilltops where Roman villas have fallen to ruin. The texture of a world that has become smaller impresses itself upon these newcomers too. The distances between viable settlements longer than their homeland experience prepared them for the connections fewer between places that might offer alliance or trade. The evening light on this landscape of fewer cultivated fields reveals the pattern of a settlement geography in flux, the old Roman grid disrupted by contraction, the new Lombard presence inserting itself into spaces vacated by death and emigration. The plague struck both the Roman and Persian empires, weakening both before the Arab expansions of the 7th century, and you understand in your westward journey that the eastern horizon holds a parallel story of diminishment and transformation. The Sassanid Empire, Rome's great rival, also suffered heavily and may have been similarly weakened, though the sources speak less directly of Persian experience. The historiographic tradition more fragmentary, the archaeological record less extensively studied. You imagine the same quality of evening light falling across the Mesopotamian plain, the same sound of a reduced population in the great cities of Ctesiphon and Gundishapwa, the same smell of scrub and wild growth reclaiming former farmland along the irrigation canals that had made the Tigris-Euphrates valley the garden of the ancient Near East. The 7th century Arab conquests occurred in a landscape already altered by plague demographic effects, and you sense how the energy of expansion released from the Arabian Peninsula encountered two great powers whose resilience had been drained by decades of disease and the fiscal military strains of their mutual warfare. The medieval world that emerged was one of smaller cities, more localized economies, and reduced long-distance trade, and you begin to see this future taking shape in the settlement patterns that spread before you. The gradual, uneven emergence of new patterns of settlement and agriculture unfolds across generations, too slow for individual observers to recognize as transformation, visible only in the accumulation of small decisions made by survivors seeking to reconstruct viable lives. You watch as peasants consolidate holdings in the more fertile valleys, abandoning the marginal lands their grandparents had wrestled into production, accepting a smaller territorial footprint in exchange for more secure subsistence. The plague's effects are debated among historians, with some emphasizing continuity over catastrophe, and you recognize in this historiographic tension the genuine complexity of a transformation that defies simple narrative. The transformation theory of late antiquity, emphasizing adaptation over decline, must account for this massive mortality, must find room in its frameworks for a demographic shock that reduced populations by perhaps a third across the Mediterranean basin and beyond. You walk through landscapes where both readings find support, where the continued use of Roman roads and the persistence of Christian institutions speak to enduring structures, while the empty fields and shrunken cities testify to a quantitative change so profound it becomes qualitative. The Justinianic plague remains a subject of intense research debate, with new genetic and archaeological evidence continuing to emerge. And you understand that your own witnessing is provisional, shaped by the sources that survive and the interpretations that frame them. The evening light deepens toward true dusk as you find yourself in a village of the later 6th century, perhaps in the Campania or along the Adriatic coast, a settlement that has reorganized itself around a core of survivors and their descendants. The quality of illumination on this landscape of fewer cultivated fields reveals the particular color that attends such transitions, the sky's gradations more visible where smoke from fewer hearths rises to meet it. The sound of a reduced population has its own acoustic signature here, the calls between neighboring houses carrying farther in the thinner air of diminished human presence, the dogs barking more persistently at strangers who arrive less frequently. You sit with the villagers as they share a meal of bread and oil, and the produce of gardens that have expanded to fill spaces once given over to commercial agriculture. Their conversation touching on matters local and immediate, the wider world present only in the occasional traveller and the rumours that arrive with the ships. The texture of a world that has become smaller is palpable in the gestures of these people, their movements less hurried, their spatial horizons contracted to what walking distance can encompass in a day. You notice how the children play among the ruins of a bathhouse that their great-grandparents would have maintained, how the stones have become simply part of their landscape rather than objects of lament or restoration. You rise and continue your journey through centuries compressed into the experience of this narrative, moving toward the longer perspectives that only hindsight affords. The Arab conquests of the 7th century unfold across the same landscapes you have traversed, the armies of Islam encountering in Syria and Egypt and North Africa populations already thinned by plague. Cities whose walls might have resisted more vigorously had their garrisons not been diminished by decades of demographic deficit. The Sassanid collapse and the Byzantine contraction in the Levant share roots in this earlier catastrophe. The plague's role as enabler of later transformations, invisible to the conquerors themselves, who attributed their success to divine favor and their own martial virtue. With later medieval plague representing a different biovar, the Black Death of the 14th century marks a separate evolutionary event, a new strain with its own patterns of transmission and mortality, though the cultural memory of earlier pestilence may have shaped responses to this later visitation. You stand in the long perspective of these recurrences, recognizing that the Justinianic plague established a template of catastrophe and adaptation that would be repeated with variations across the millennium that followed. The ancient world's integrated trade networks, already strained, were transformed into more localized systems, and the urban centers that survived did so at a fraction of their former scale, their populations measured in thousands where once tens of thousands had congregated. The Lombard presence in Italy consolidates across the decades following their initial arrival, and you observe the gradual emergence of a new political geography in the peninsula, the Byzantine holdings contracting toward the south and the coastal cities, the Lombard kingdom establishing itself in the north and center with a capital at Pavia. The reconquest of Italy, already difficult, had been further complicated by plague-related troop losses and revenue decline, and the Lombard success represents the final undoing of Justinian's Italian project. The restoration of imperial rule proved ephemeral against the demographic realities that disease had established. You find yourself in the 8th century now, looking back across 200 years of transformation, and the evening light on this perspective reveals how slowly the significance of change becomes apparent. The plague is considered one factor in the end of antiquity in the 6th century, yet to those who lived through its initial outbreaks and subsequent recurrences, the experience was one of episodic crisis rather than epochal transition, of adaptation to immediate pressures rather than conscious navigation between historical eras. The quality of evening light on a landscape with fewer cultivated fields has become simply the quality of evening light, the reduction so long established that it no longer registers as loss. The sound of a reduced population has become the normal acoustic environment, the more constant human noise of antiquity, surviving only in textual description and architectural scale. You walk through Ravenna or Rome or Naples, cities that maintain their episcopal sees and some commercial function, yet whose populations would astonish their imperial-era predecessors by their modesty. The texture of a world that has become smaller, distances longer, connections fewer, has become simply the texture of the world, the expanded horizons of Roman integration surviving as aspiration rather than as lived experience. You stand finally at a vantage point of the later 8th or early 9th century, looking back across the full span that separates your position from the Constantinople hilltop where this journey began. The evening light falls across a Mediterranean world that has passed through profound alteration, its populations smaller, its cities more modest, its economies more localized, its political structures simplified, yet also a world that has preserved much, adapted much, found ways to maintain meaning and order within constraint. The Lombard arrival in Italy in 568, finding a peninsula weakened by decades of conflict and the lingering effects of the Justinianic plague, represents one vector of transformation among many, as Germanic migrations that had reshaped the western provinces for 2 centuries found new expression in a devastated landscape. The genetic legacy of Yersinia pestis, Bio var Antiqua, may have persisted, with later medieval plague possibly representing a different Bio var, and the biological dimension of this history extends beyond any single episode, with the pathogen and its hosts potentially engaged in a co-evolutionary relationship across millennia. The sound of a reduced population has become, in this later perspective, simply the sound of the world as it is, the acoustic environment that shapes the hearing of a new civilization. You descend from your final vantage point as the evening light fades toward true darkness. The quality of illumination on this landscape of fewer cultivated fields, revealing its last gradations of rose and amber before surrendering to night. The long perspective, centuries later, recognizes this as a turning point whose full significance was invisible to those who lived it. The transformation they experienced a series of discrete challenges, revealing itself to hindsight as the great transition between ancient and medieval civilizations. The stars emerge in a sky less dimmed by the lights of great cities, the reduced population of the Mediterranean world visible in this celestial clarity, as in so many other indices of change. You move through the darkness toward rest, carrying with you the accumulated weight of witness to a transformation that unfolded across lifetimes, that shaped the world in which you stand, that remains present in the genetic heritage of surviving populations, in the ecological systems that still harbor the pathogen's descendants, in the historiographic debates that continue to seek its proper measure. The night deepens around you, the particular darkness of a landscape with fewer cultivated fields, less constant human noise, more room for the sounds of wind and water, and the movements of creatures that have reclaimed spaces once dominated by human purpose. The evening light has gone now, the darkness complete, the sensory world contracting to the immediate space around you, the warmth of your own presence in a landscape that has known so much diminishment yet persists. The texture of a world that has become smaller yields in this darkness to the texture of sleep, the distances that seemed so long in daylight folding into the immediate interior of consciousness. You rest now in the knowledge that the world you have traversed continues, changed and changing, its transformations visible to those who will come after with the clarity that only hindsight provides, its present moment opaque with the density of lived experience that cannot yet recognize itself as history.